They said my backyard wedding was trashy. My mother looked me in the eye and said, "This isn't a real wedding, it's a pity party in dirt." My sister. She laughed behind my back, clinking champagne glasses on a yacht as they celebrated her engagement like she was royalty. They didn't even RSVP to mine. I decorated that backyard myself, hung every strand of fairy lights, folded every napkin, arranged the wildflowers from the farmer's market because no one else would. And just when they thought they had erased me from the family spotlight, a helicopter landed. Right there, on the grass they once called filthy. The door opened, and out stepped the man they'd mocked as a nobody. Except he wasn't a nobody. He was the CEO of a $12 billion company. And our wedding. It wasn't private. It was aired live across national television. My parents watched the broadcast from their dinner party, phones buzzing, guests staring, pride melting off their faces like wax. Then came the message from my father. "Can we come in?" I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I simply replied out loud with a quiet chuckle and 5 words. Too late. Much too late. This is not just a story about revenge. It's about reclaiming your voice when everyone else tried to silence it. Stay with me because what happened before and after that helicopter moment, it's something you'll never forget. My name is Ellie Monroe. At 28, I was working as a painter and part-time art teacher in a small town outside Sacramento. My life was not glamorous, but it was full of colors, sketches, and the quiet dream of building something that was my own. I had never longed for a castle or ballroom. I longed for a place that felt true, a celebration that reflected who I was, not who my family thought I should be. After everything that happened, people always ask me where it began. It began with a dream that sounded so harmless, so small that I never thought it would spark such scorn. I wanted a backyard wedding, not a yacht, not a ballroom draped in crystal chandeliers. Just a backyard filled with wildflowers and fairy lights with the smell of grass and the sound of laughter, something deeply personal. To me, that backyard was not just a patch of land. It was a canvas waiting to be painted with joy. I pictured wooden chairs set under an old oak tree, strings of paper lanterns glowing against the dusk, and my vows spoken under the same stars that had watched over me as a girl. That was my vision. I remember the night I told my family. We were seated around the table, dinner served with the usual ritual of my mother leading every conversation, and Samantha, my older sister, holding court like a queen. I shared my idea gently, almost shyly, like unwrapping a delicate painting before people who might not understand. For a moment there was silence. Then my mother tilted her head back and laughed a laugh that was sharp and cutting, not kind. "A backyard wedding," she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Ellie, do you even hear yourself? That's not a wedding. That's a yard sale with vows." My sister smirked, twirling the stem of her wine glass. "So very you, Ellie. Always with the little dreams." It is hard to explain how laughter can wound more than anger, but in that moment it cut me. I felt myself shrink in my chair, my face burning. I tried to explain what I envisioned, how it would be intimate and filled with meaning, how I wanted a place that felt like home. But their faces told me everything. To them, it was not a dream. It was proof that I was small, unworthy, and foolish. That night I walked home with the echo of their laughter in my ears. I pulled out my sketchbook, the one I kept by my bedside. Instead of drawing flowers or portraits, I drew the layout of my imagined wedding. I mapped where the arbor would stand, where guests would sit, where the fairy lights would hang. It calmed me the way drawing always did. On paper, at least, my vision was safe. Still, a quiet doubt whispered in me. Was I wrong to want something so simple? Was I embarrassing myself? A week later, my mother called me. She did not ask about my work or how I was doing. She went straight to the point. "Ellie," she said, "you really ought to think this through. Your sister just got engaged and we're planning her party on a yacht. Imagine how it looks to have one daughter celebrated in luxury while the other plays pretend in a backyard." I tried to steady my voice, but it shook as I answered, It looks like two daughters making choices that suit them, and mine suits me." There was a long pause. Then she sighed, the kind of sigh that carried disappointment deeper than words. "This is why people don't take you seriously, Ellie." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the counter. The words echoed in me. Not taken seriously. That was always the undercurrent of how they saw me. Wasn't it? The daughter who colored outside the lines. The one who never matched Samantha's polish. I thought about calling my father, hoping he might listen differently. He didn't answer. He didn't even return my call. The silence said enough. It was Aunt Mary who kept me from crumbling. She had always been the odd one out in the family, an artist who wore her paint-stained apron even to the grocery store. She lived in a small house with a sprawling garden that felt more like a secret world. When I told her my idea, her eyes lit up not with ridicule, but with delight. A wedding under the stars. In my garden, she said, her voice warm. "Ellie, that sounds perfect." We walked her yard together that afternoon. She pointed to the wooden swing under the big tree and said, "You could hang lanterns from here. Imagine the glow." For the first time in weeks, I let myself smile. She made me believe it wasn't foolish. It was beautiful. Still, the whispers returned. My cousin called to say my mother had described my plan as a backyard barbecue disguised as a wedding. They laughed about it at Sunday dinner, she said, as though I were not family, but the punchline of a joke. Each word was another stone on my chest. I held on to the image in my sketchbook. The lights, the flowers, the vows. I held on to Aunt Mary's faith in me. And though their laughter lingered, I whispered to myself that I would not let them decide the worth of my dream. I told myself again and again, "This is mine. They can laugh, but this is mine." At the time, I did not know how much power those words would hold, or how far that trashy little backyard dream would take me. I only knew I had to protect it because it was all I had left. Dinner at my parents' house had always carried a certain tension for me, but that evening it felt like every glance, every pause between bites was weighted with expectation. I had just come from Aunt Mary's, her words of encouragement still echoing in my head, and I decided it was time to share more openly what I was planning. Sitting there across from my parents and Samantha, I spoke as clearly as I could, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I've been planning more details for my wedding," I said. "It will be in the backyard at Aunt Mary's place. It will be simple with lanterns, wildflowers, and close friends." For a heartbeat, the table was silent. My mother's fork clinked against her plate as she put it down. Then she burst into laughter. It was not laughter of joy or surprise, but the sort of dismissive mocking laugh that makes a person feel very small. She looked directly at me, her lips curling. "Ellie, honestly, that's nothing short of trash. Who wants to stand in dirt and weeds when your sister is preparing to host a real wedding? Something worthy of respect. You should be taking notes from Samantha, not embarrassing us with this yard nonsense." The words hit me harder than I expected. Trash. The way she said it, like my dream was not just foolish, but offensive. I wanted to defend myself, to explain the meaning of a wedding that reflected love instead of spectacle. But before I could speak, Samantha chimed in. She leaned back in her chair, the diamond on her hand catching the light as she smirked. "That's always been the problem with you, Ellie. You think small, you act small. You've spent your whole life copying bits of me trying to measure up. But you'll always just be my shadow, and shadows don't shine." I felt the sting in her words sharper because they were delivered so casually, as if she were stating a fact rather than inflicting cruelty. My father stayed silent, his eyes fixed on his plate. He did not laugh, but he also did not intervene, and that silence was its own betrayal. I looked around the table at the people who were supposed to love me, and I realized they were not simply doubting my choices. They were denying my right to have choices at all. I pushed the food around my plate, unable to swallow. The conversation carried on without me shifting back to Samantha's wedding plans, the guest list, the caterers, the yacht. It was as if I had never spoken. My presence at the table shrank until I felt invisible. I excused myself quietly, no one stopping me, no one asking where I was going. Upstairs in my childhood bedroom, I closed the door and sat on the bed pulling out my journal. The lamplight flickered against the pages as I tried to capture the ache in my chest. My pen scratched across the paper as I wrote, "They laughed when I shared my dream. Mom called it trash. Samantha said I'm her shadow. Why does every word from them cut so deep? Why can't they see me as I am instead of what they want me to be?" I paused, staring at those words, and added, "Maybe I've been foolish to believe I could ever be celebrated for myself. Maybe they'll only ever see me as less." The tears came then, slow and quiet, as if they had been waiting. I did not sob. I simply let the sadness sink into me the way water seeps into paper until it warps and can no longer lie flat. Writing it down helped a little, but the pain lingered. I thought of Aunt Mary's warm eyes and the way she saw beauty where others saw inconvenience. Her belief in me was real, but so was the scorn I had just faced. Between those two worlds, I felt stretched thin, uncertain which one I belonged to. When I finally closed my journal, I pressed my hand to the cover as if sealing away the hurt. I whispered to myself, one day I'll prove them wrong. One day they'll see I was never trash. But even as I spoke the words, a part of me wondered if I would ever be strong enough to make them true. That night, I fell asleep with my dreams overshadowed by their laughter, not yet knowing how far those wounds would carry me, or how they would shape the woman I would become. News of my sister's engagement spread through the family like wildfire. I should have been prepared for the spectacle, but I wasn't. A week after that painful dinner where my mother and Samantha laughed at my plans, I opened my email to find an ornate digital invitation in my inbox, not addressed to me, but accidentally forwarded from a cousin. At the top, written in elegant gold script, were the words, "Join us in celebrating Samantha and Charles on a private yacht." The details were lavish catered meals by a celebrity chef, a champagne tower, and a guest list that read like the social pages of a magazine. Everyone of importance in my parents' circle was invited. Everyone except me. At first, I thought there had been some mistake. Maybe my invitation had been lost. Maybe my mother had forgotten to send it. But as I scrolled down the long list of recipients, my name was nowhere to be found. The realization sank in slowly like a cold tide pulling me under. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had chosen to exclude me. Within hours, photographs of the yacht party began appearing online. Aunts and uncles, old family friends, even neighbors from our street posted pictures with captions full of admiration. "What a stunning engagement for Samantha," one wrote. "The Monroes know how to do things right." Others chimed in with comments that stung more than they realized. So elegant, so different from the usual backyard kind of celebration. I didn't have to guess what usual backyard meant. It meant me. On social media, comparisons were swift and merciless. People I had grown up with wrote things like, "Samantha always knew how to shine. Poor Ellie never stood a chance." Some posted side-by-side photos of my art showings, quiet, modest affairs, next to images of Samantha draped in designer gowns on the yacht. The message was clear. One sister was a star, the other a shadow. I stared at my phone, scrolling through the endless stream of polished images. Samantha in a sequined dress, smiling as her fiancé held her hand. My mother beaming with pride beside them, her arm linked with my father's, the two of them looking as though they had won some prize. I wasn't mentioned in a single caption. It was as though I didn't exist. The worst part wasn't the glittering champagne or the smug smiles. It was the silence. Not one person asked where I was. Not one reached out to say, "Ellie, why aren't you there?" To them, my absence was natural, expected. That evening, I paced my small apartment, the invitation still open on my laptop. My chest felt tight, the air heavy. Finally, I dialed my mother's number, clinging to the hope that she would explain, that she would tell me it was all a misunderstanding. She answered on the third ring, her voice crisp. "Mom." I began trying to keep my tone calm, I saw the invitation for Samantha's engagement party. I wasn't on the list. Was that a mistake? There was a pause on the other end. Then her answer came cool and deliberate. It wasn't a mistake, Ellie. You don't fit in with that kind of event. You wouldn't be comfortable. I gripped the phone tighter. Not comfortable. She's my sister. Shouldn't I at least be there? Her sigh was sharp. This is a celebration for Samantha with people who understand her world. You would only make things awkward. It's better this way. Her words were like ice, final and unyielding. I wanted to shout to demand why my presence was such an embarrassment, but no words came. Instead, I whispered, I just wanted to support her. You can support her in your own way, she said before ending the call without a goodbye. I set the phone down and sat at the edge of my bed staring at nothing. Support her in my own way. What did that even mean? I had been erased from her narrative, from the family's celebration, from everything that should have bound us together. Later that night, I opened my journal again. My pen shook as I wrote, They have chosen their daughter, and it is not me. They have dressed her in light and left me in shadow. Today I was not just forgotten, I was unwanted. The ink smeared as my tears fell on the page, but I kept writing until the pain dulled enough to let me close the book. In the quiet of that room, I finally understood the truth in my parents' eyes. Samantha wasn't just their golden child, she was the only child worth celebrating. And no matter how much I longed to belong, they had already made their choice. The memory of being left out of Samantha's yacht celebration was still fresh when my mother called me one afternoon asking me to come by the house. Her voice carried a tone that suggested urgency, though not warmth. I went foolishly hoping that perhaps she wanted to make amends, or at least acknowledge the hurt that had been building inside me. Instead, when I arrived, she led me wordlessly upstairs to the spare bedroom. On the bed lay a large white garment bag. Here, she said briskly, pulling open the zipper with a flourish, as though revealing a gift. The fabric spilled out onto the quilt-lace satin and tulle in shades of ivory that had yellowed with time. She smoothed it out with her hands. This will do for your wedding. It's perfectly fine for something small like what you're planning. I stared at it, my breath catching. Recognition dawned slow and sickening. It was Samantha's dress, the one she had worn years ago when everyone whispered she might be pregnant. The dress had been hastily altered back then to hide what my parents thought would be a scandal. I remembered the tight smiles, the hushed conversations, the way the dress had become a symbol of shame disguised as elegance. And now it was being offered to me as though my wedding, my one day, was not worthy of anything better. My mother looked pleased with herself. Why waste money on something new? You're not hosting senators or CEOs. A backyard wedding hardly needs couture. This dress is enough. Enough. The word stung. Enough for me because in their eyes I had never deserved more. My fingers curled into fists at my sides. For years I had taken their barbs in silence, swallowing the hurt and nodding along. But standing there staring at that dress with its history of compromise and humiliation, something in me broke. No, I said quietly at first. My mother frowned, not comprehending. I raised my voice, the words tearing out of me before I could stop them. No, I will not wear that. I will not stand in front of the man I love in a dress that wasn't meant for me, a dress that carries someone else's shame. This is my wedding, and I will choose what I wear. Do you hear me? I want my own dress for my own day. The air went still. My voice echoed against the walls sharper than I had ever allowed it to be in this house. My mother's expression hardened instantly, as though my defiance had cracked something in her pride. You ungrateful girl, she hissed. Do you know how much we spent on that dress? Do you know how lucky you are to even have it offered to you? Most daughters would be thankful. Thankful. That word, too, cut me in a different way. Thankful for hand-me-downs. Thankful for scraps of dignity. Thankful for being treated as second best. My throat tightened, but I refused to back down. I'm not most daughters, I said firmly. And I will not let you decide the worth of my wedding. Her eyes narrowed, and I knew she saw the change in me. For the first time, I had raised my voice. For the first time, I had said no. There was a pause long enough for me to hear my own heart pounding in my ears, and then she shook her head and muttered, "You'll regret this. You always regret when you defy me." I turned toward the door, but before leaving, I looked back at the dress one last time. The lace shimmered in the sunlight coming through the window, but to me it looked like a cage, a relic of control. I thought about all the times I had bent myself to fit their image, all the times I had tried to earn approval by being quiet, agreeable, invisible. No more. That night in the solitude of my apartment, I wrote furiously in my journal. Today they called me ungrateful. Today they offered me my sister's discarded shame. But today, for the first time, I said no. I will not carry the weight of their expectations down the aisle. I will walk in a dress of my choosing, even if I have to stitch it together with my own 2 hands. The words steadied me. They reminded me that even though my family's voices were loud, mine mattered too. That confrontation had been painful, but it was also clarifying. I could not expect them to honor me. I had to honor myself. And though I didn't yet know where the path would lead, I knew this much. The day of my wedding would not be a replay of my family's past mistakes. It would be mine, built from my vision, my choices, my voice. For once, I had chosen to fight for myself, and I could feel the ground beneath me shift. Something inside me was waking up. The confrontation over the dress still lingered in the air when my mother called me back to the house a few days later. Her voice on the phone had been sharp, almost businesslike, and I had a sinking feeling that whatever she wanted to discuss would not be about reconciliation. When I arrived, she was already seated at the dining table with Samantha and my father, papers spread out in front of them as though they were negotiating some contract. My mother gestured for me to sit, her face set in the mask of authority I had known my whole life. "We've been talking," she began, tapping her manicured nail against the papers, "and we think the most sensible decision is to combine your wedding with Samantha's. It will save money, it will be less confusing for guests, and frankly, Ellie, it will be better for the family's reputation." She said it with such conviction that for a brief second I thought she might actually believe it. Samantha smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held triumph just beneath the surface. I blinked at them, stunned. "Combine our weddings? You mean have one ceremony for both of us?" "Of course," my mother replied smoothly. "Samantha's already secured the yacht, the catering, the guest list. It would be simple to add your name to the invitations. You wouldn't have to worry about anything, and honestly, it would be more dignified than whatever backyard plan you've been clinging to." The words landed like stones. This was not about helping me or saving money. This was about erasing me, making sure I disappeared into Samantha's spotlight. My mother's tone made it sound like a generous offer, but I could see the truth written on her face. I took a breath, my voice firm, though my hands trembled beneath the table. "No. This is my wedding. It will not be combined with Samantha's. I will not be a footnote in her story." My father shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. My mother's eyes narrowed. "Ellie, don't be foolish. You cannot afford this on your own. Without our help, you'll end up with paper plates and folding chairs. Do you really want to embarrass yourself like that?" I met her gaze. "I would rather have paper plates in my own backyard than be paraded as Samantha's shadow on a yacht." The silence that followed was heavy. Samantha finally spoke, her tone dripping with condescension. "See, Mother, I told you she'd be ungrateful. She doesn't understand what's best for her." My mother's expression hardened. "Very well. If that's how you feel, then you're on your own. We will not provide any financial support, not a cent. If you choose to humiliate yourself, you'll do it without dragging this family's money into it. You're unworthy of the investment. Unworthy." The words sliced through me, but I forced myself not to flinch. I pushed back my chair and stood, my knees shaking, but my voice steady. "Then I'll do it myself. I don't need your money. I don't need your approval. This is my life, and I will make it mine." I left the house with my heart pounding and tears threatening, but underneath the hurt was something else, resolve. Back in my apartment, I pulled out the small lockbox where I kept the earnings from my art sales. It wasn't much, just years of careful saving from selling paintings at local fairs, modest checks from students who bought my smaller pieces, and a little tucked away from the classes I taught. I counted the bills slowly, each one a reminder that I had built something with my own hands. It would be tight, but it was possible. As I stacked the bills neatly back into the box, I whispered to myself, "This is enough. It has to be enough." I knew the wedding wouldn't have champagne towers or a guest list filled with executives and senators. It wouldn't make the society pages. But it would be mine. Every petal, every light, every vow would carry my mark. That night I called Aunt Mary. Her voice, warm and steady, filled me with a sense of peace. "You'll make it beautiful, Ellie," she said firmly. "Beauty doesn't need a yacht or chandeliers, it needs honesty. And you, my dear, have that in abundance." For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe her. I sat at my desk with my sketchbook open, planning again, this time with fiercer strokes of my pencil. No longer was this about just having a wedding. This was about claiming my voice. If my family saw me as unworthy, then I would show them what worth looked like. I would show them that I could stand on my own. The laughter, the insults, the cold dismissal, they still stung, but they also lit something inside me. I realized I could not wait for my family to honor me. I had to honor myself. And though I had no idea yet how difficult the road ahead would be, I knew my wedding would not be erased, combined, or forgotten. It would be my stand, a declaration that I was no longer their shadow. I had begun to steady myself after deciding to fund my own wedding, but the past has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest resolve. It happened unexpectedly in the most ordinary of places. I was at the grocery store, standing in line with a basket of produce, when I heard a voice behind me. It was a voice I knew well, one that once made me believe in forever. I turned and found myself face to face with Daniel, the man I had dated 3 years ago, the man I thought I would marry before everything fell apart. His smile faltered when he saw me. He shifted uncomfortably, as though caught somewhere he didn't belong. We exchanged polite words, but the conversation quickly grew awkward. When I asked how he was, he said he was doing well, working for a firm in the city, and then without invitation he mentioned Samantha. My stomach tightened. He spoke her name casually, as though it had always been natural for my sister to be in his life. That was when the truth surfaced. It came out not from Daniel himself, but from the woman standing beside him. She was a colleague of his, someone who clearly knew both him and my sister. She laughed lightly and said, "You know, I always thought it was so bold of Samantha to go after you while you were still with Ellie. Not everyone would have that kind of nerve." Her words fell into the air like shards of glass. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my mind racing to understand. Daniel stammered, trying to cover the moment, but the damage was done. Images and memories flooded back, how suddenly he had ended things, how he never gave me a clear reason, how quickly Samantha had dismissed my heartbreak at the time. Now I understood. It hadn't been fate or distance or some vague incompatibility. It had been Samantha deliberately reaching into my life and taking what was mine, and Daniel had let her. I managed to leave the store without breaking down, but as soon as I was home, I collapsed onto the couch, shaking. Anger and humiliation boiled inside me. I wanted to scream, but instead I reached for my phone and dialed my mother. I asked her outright if she had known. The pause on the other end was long, but when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost dismissive. "Of course we knew, Ellie. We didn't tell you because we thought it would help you. Samantha was better suited for him, and we believed you needed to learn resilience. Life isn't fair, and sometimes you have to be tested to grow stronger." Tested. That was the word she used, as though my heartbreak had been some classroom exercise, as though my pain had been arranged like a lesson plan. I pressed her further, my voice trembling, asking how she could possibly condone her own daughter stealing from me. She sighed, clearly impatient. "Don't be dramatic, Ellie. He wasn't the right man for you, and you're better off without him. You should be thanking us for letting it play out." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. My hands were shaking and my chest ached, as if the betrayal had only just happened. I thought back to the countless times I had questioned myself after Daniel left, the nights I had cried alone, wondering what I had done wrong. All along, my family had stood by, not only aware of the truth, but supportive of it. They hadn't just watched me suffer. They had decided my suffering was useful. That night, I pulled out my journal again. The pages had become the only place where I could be entirely myself. My pen scratched across the paper as I wrote, pouring out the weight of the discovery. 3 years ago, I thought I was broken because I wasn't enough. Tonight, I learned I was broken because they wanted me broken. My own family chose her happiness over my dignity. I was not a daughter to them. I was an experiment. I stopped writing and stared at the words. They looked foreign, yet they captured exactly how I felt, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by people who should have loved me. Every step I had taken, every choice I thought was mine, had been shadowed by their manipulation. My heart sank with the realization that I had been nothing more than a convenient lesson in resilience for their golden child's benefit. I closed the journal and pressed it to my chest, the tears finally spilling. Betrayal from a stranger is painful, but betrayal from family seeps into the bones. It makes you question not only your worth, but your very place in the world. For the first time, I felt truly untethered. I was not just alone. I was disposable in their eyes. And though I did not know it yet, that knowledge would become the very fire that pushed me to take back control of my life. Chris proposed to me on a rainy Thursday evening, the kind of night that most people would find ordinary, but to me it felt like something quietly sacred. We had gone for a walk after dinner, our umbrellas knocking together as we strolled through the park. The rain had left the benches slick, the pathways glistening in the lamplight. Chris stopped under one of those lamps, his glasses fogged his hair damp against his forehead, and he reached into his pocket. His hand trembled a little as he pulled out a small box. "I don't have much to give you," he said softly, "but I have this, and I have myself. Will you marry me?" When I opened the box, inside was not a stone large enough to blind anyone or a band made to impress a room. It was a thin silver ring with a modest blue stone in the center, simple and unassuming, but it sparkled in the light, like it had been waiting for me all along. My throat tightened, tears blurring my vision, and I whispered, "Yes." He slipped it onto my finger, and in that moment the whole world narrowed to the warmth of his hands and the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, I felt chosen, not because of money, not because of family status, but simply for being myself. I went home that night with my heart racing, the rain still clinging to my coat, staring at the ring as though it carried the promise of a better future. When I shared the news with my family, the reaction was not joy, not even polite acknowledgement. We were sitting around the living room when I showed them the ring. I held out my hand, expecting at least a small smile, a nod, maybe even a congratulations. Instead, my mother narrowed her eyes at the delicate band. Samantha let out a laugh, sharp and dismissive, while my father remained impassive, his silence heavy in the room. "This," my mother said, her lips twisting. "That's what he gave you, Ellie. It looks like something from a flea market." Samantha leaned forward, her eyes glinting with cruelty. "Chris is a teacher, right?" "What did you expect? A diamond the size of mine." "You really don't understand how the world works, do you?" "But I suppose it suits you. You've always been the type to settle." I tried to hold my ground, to remind myself that this ring meant more to me than any jewel could, but each word chipped away at the fragile joy I had been carrying. When my mother added, "He's a nice enough man, but he's not going anywhere. You'll never climb with him, Ellie. You'll always be stuck at the bottom. Maybe that's all you deserve." My chest ached as if they had taken the ring and crushed it in their hands. I glanced at my father, searching for something in his expression, a flicker of support, but he only adjusted his glasses and turned away. There were no congratulations, no hugs, no acknowledgement that I had taken a step forward in my life. Just silence, cold and suffocating. I smiled weakly, slipped my hand back, and let the conversation move on to Samantha's latest dress fitting. My engagement, my promise of a future, had been dismissed as nothing more than a poor choice. Later, alone in my room, I sat on the bed and stared at the ring again. The blue stone still shone in the light, steady and calm. I thought about Chris, his kindness, the way he had looked at me under that lamp. That was real. That was what mattered. Yet no matter how much I tried to cling to that truth, a deep loneliness settled in me. My family had always found ways to diminish me, but this time, the wound cut deeper. They hadn't just rejected my choices, they had rejected the man I loved. I felt isolated like a stranger in my own home carrying a joy no one else wanted to share. Still, I told myself I could bear it. I whispered in my journal that night. They don't see the value in him, but I do. He is steady, he is kind, and he chose me. Maybe that is enough to keep me standing. As I closed the book, I touched the ring once more, feeling the weight of it on my finger. It was not heavy with gold or diamonds, but it was heavy with meaning. And even in the silence of my family's rejection, I held on to the hope that Chris could be the anchor I so desperately needed. The days after our engagement should have been filled with excitement and planning, but instead they were clouded with unease. My family's silence weighed on me, but I told myself that Chris and I could create something beautiful together regardless of their approval. I clung to that thought like a lifeline. We chose a date small and practical, and I began stringing together the pieces of a modest backyard wedding with the savings I had set aside. Aunt Mary offered her garden, and I poured my energy into gathering flowers, sketching decorations, and dreaming of a night lit by lanterns and love. It was a quiet Sunday morning when everything unraveled. I was scrolling through my phone sipping coffee when a notification appeared. A cousin had gone live on social media. Out of habit, more than interest, I tapped to watch. My heart stopped as the video loaded. There was Samantha, radiant in a gown that sparkled like diamonds under the sun, standing on the deck of a yacht. Music played, champagne flowed, and hundreds of guests clapped as my parents made a toast. At the bottom of the screen, the caption read, "Celebrating Samantha and Charles' engagement party of the year." My eyes darted to the date. It was the same day as my wedding. At first, I thought it couldn't be true. Surely they hadn't planned this to coincide with mine. But as I watched the feed, the truth pressed down with crushing force. My family had deliberately chosen that day, knowing full well what it meant to me. I saw faces in the crowd, friends I had grown up with, cousins who had promised to come to my ceremony, neighbors who had known me since childhood. They were all there laughing, dancing, raising their glasses in honor of Samantha. Not one message had come to me to explain. Not one person had told me they wouldn't make it. They had simply vanished into her orbit, leaving my day hollow before it had even begun. By noon, the reality was undeniable. I stood in the backyard where rows of chairs sat empty, the ribbons fluttering in the breeze as though mocking me. The lanterns I had strung the night before swayed in the sunlight, waiting for guests who would never arrive. My chest ached as I stared at the vacant space, the silence louder than any jeer. It was supposed to be filled with voices, laughter, music. Instead, it was only me, Aunt Mary, bustling quietly in the kitchen, and Chris standing awkwardly by the arbor. Chris looked at me with a mixture of pity and discomfort. He had been patient with my family's coldness until now, but I could see something shifting in his eyes as he glanced at his phone, no doubt flooded with photos from the yacht. "Ellie," he said hesitantly, his voice low. Maybe we rushed this." I turned toward him, stunned. "Rushed? We've been planning this for months. This is our day." He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my gaze. "It's just, with your family making such a big deal out of Samantha's party and everyone choosing to be there instead of here. I don't know. It makes me wonder if maybe we should wait. Maybe we should take some time to think this through." His words stung deeper than I expected. I had known he was uncomfortable with the constant comparisons, the disapproval, but hearing him waver at the very altar we had built together felt like betrayal. "Are you saying you don't want this?" I asked, my voice trembling. Chris sighed heavily. "I'm saying I need time. The pressure from your family, from everyone. It's a lot. I don't know if I can handle being in the middle of it." I looked at him, the man who had once slipped a ring onto my finger under a lamplight, the man who had promised me forever. Now he stood uncertain, his love bent under the weight of my family's disdain. The ring on my finger suddenly felt heavier than ever. I nodded slowly, though inside my heart was cracking. "If you need time, then take it," I whispered. He didn't move closer, didn't take my hand. He simply nodded back, his expression unreadable. In that silence, I realized that the little hope I had clung to, that Chris would be my anchor against the storm, was slipping away. Later that evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the lanterns lit up the empty garden, I sat alone in one of the chairs meant for guests. The soft glow fell across the empty rows, and I let the tears fall freely. My family had chosen Samantha. My friends had followed, and now Chris was wavering too. I had never felt so abandoned, so completely invisible. But even through the despair, a tiny ember of defiance stirred in me. I whispered to myself, "They can take away their presence, their approval, even their love. But they cannot take away me." I didn't believe it fully yet, but I needed to say it. Because if I didn't cling to that small spark, I feared I would disappear altogether. Chris's hesitation at the empty backyard had been the first crack, but it didn't take long for that small fracture to spread into something that destroyed the entire foundation. A few days later, he came to my apartment carrying the weight of someone who had already made a decision. He didn't sit down, didn't try to soften it with small talk. He simply looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Ellie, I can't do this anymore." My chest tightened, but I tried to stay calm. "Can't do what?" He ran his hand through his hair, sighing. "All of it. The pressure, the constant drama with your family, the way it all makes you spiral. You're not stable. And I can't spend my life in the middle of this storm. I need peace, Ellie. I don't think you can give me that." The words hit me harder than I expected. Unstable. That was what he saw when he looked at me. Not the woman who had said yes to his proposal under the lamplight, not the one who believed in him when no one else did. To him, I was just a problem he couldn't solve, a burden he no longer wanted to carry. My throat burned, but I refused to let him see me break. "So that's it?" I asked. "You give me a ring, then decide I'm too much?" Chris didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor and whispered, "I'm sorry, but this isn't what I want." And with that, he left. The sound of the door clicking shut felt like the end of more than just a relationship. It felt like the end of hope. I sat there for hours, staring at the ring on my finger, the small blue stone that had once meant everything. Eventually, I slipped it off, placed it on the table, and walked away from it. It looked so small sitting there, like a reminder of how little I truly mattered. When my family found out, there was no comfort, no sympathy. Instead, my mother's voice came sharp over the phone. "You see, we told you no one would want to marry you." At least Chris figured it out before he wasted more of his life. Samantha laughed in the background, and my father added flatly, "It's better this way. You're not cut out for marriage. You should accept that." Their words pierced deeper than Chris's departure. If even my own parents believed I was unworthy of love, then maybe it was true. I felt stripped bare, emptied of value. For the first time in my life, I couldn't even muster the strength to argue. I simply hung up the phone and sat in silence, the world collapsing inward. Days turned into weeks, and I withdrew further into myself. I stopped answering calls, stopped replying to the few messages from distant acquaintances who wondered how I was doing. I packed up my apartment and moved out of town, leaving no forwarding address. I didn't want anyone to find me, not family, not friends. I wanted to disappear because disappearing seemed easier than being reminded of how unwanted I had become. I rented a small room above a garage in a town where no one knew my name. The windows overlooked nothing more than cracked pavement and a rusted fence, but at least it was quiet. My sketchbooks sat in a stack by the wall, unopened. The paints that had once brought me solace dried up in their tubes. Every time I looked at them, my stomach twisted. Painting had been a reflection of me, and right then I couldn't bear to see myself on canvas. Nights were the worst. I lay awake listening to the hollow sound of the wind through the eaves, replaying every word my family had ever said, every laugh that cut, every dismissal that burned. Their voices became my own, echoing in my mind, until I almost believed them. Maybe I really was unstable. Maybe no one would ever want me. Maybe I was destined to remain in the shadow, unseen and unworthy. I stopped keeping a journal. The words refused to come. What was there left to write? It felt like every sentence would only be a confirmation of my emptiness. The pen that had once poured out my pain now sat unused, its ink sealed away, like the emotions I tried to bury. There were mornings when I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed, when the thought of facing another day of silence felt unbearable. The once vibrant girl who had dreamed of fairy lights and wildflowers was gone. In her place was someone dulled by sorrow, cut off from the life she had tried so hard to build. And yet even in that darkness, some small part of me lingered, clinging to the faint hope that this wasn't the end of my story. I didn't believe it then, not fully. But somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of betrayal and grief, a flicker remained. It would be a long time before I could see it, but that flicker would one day grow into the fire that would carry me forward. For now, though, I was lost, broken, and silent, a shadow of the woman I once hoped to be. When the silence of my rented room became unbearable, and the shadows of abandonment pressed in too tightly, I finally made a call I should have made months before. Aunt Mary answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the warmth that I had been starved of. She didn't ask for explanations, didn't probe into the wounds that were still raw. She simply said, "Come here, Ellie, my door is always open." And just like that, I packed what little I had and left that small town behind. Arriving at her home felt like stepping into another world. The air smelled of turpentine and lavender, and canvases leaned against every wall. Sunlight spilled through tall windows onto paint-splattered floors. Aunt Mary, with her silver hair pulled back loosely and her apron marked with the colors of her day's work, embraced me with arms that had always been a safe place. "You look tired, darling," she whispered, and I let myself collapse into the comfort I had long been denied. Living with her was nothing like the coldness of my parents' house. She let me sleep as long as I needed, let me eat when I was ready, and never once made me feel like a burden. But she did watch me carefully, as though waiting for the moment I would pick myself back up. One evening, as I sat staring at the bare wall of the guest room, she came in carrying a small box. Setting it in front of me, she said, "These were mine when I was your age. Brushes, paints, a few old canvases. They're waiting for a hand that needs them." I shook my head, tears filling my eyes. I don't think I can anymore. It feels like everything I touch turns to disappointment. Mary knelt in front of me, taking my hands in hers. Her grip was firm, her eyes steady. "Listen to me, Ellie. You are not a victim. Victims are powerless. You, my dear, are a survivor. Survivors take the pain and turn it into something new. You've carried enough sorrow. Now let it carry you into your art." Her words struck something deep within me. For so long I had thought of myself as the broken one, the one left behind, unworthy of love or celebration. But the way she said survivor made me feel as though maybe there was a kind of strength hidden beneath the wreckage. That night, for the first time in months, I opened a sketchbook. My hand trembled as I drew the first lines, hesitant and uneven. But once the pencil moved, it refused to stop. The next morning, Mary set up an easel in her garden and placed a blank canvas on it. "Paint," she said, simply handing me a brush. My fingers closed around the handle as though it was both foreign and familiar. I dipped it into the paint, and with the first stroke, something inside me cracked open. What spilled onto the canvas was not beauty in the traditional sense. It was raw and jagged swirls of dark blues and violent red shapes that carried the weight of my heartbreak. But as I painted, I felt the burden lift piece by piece. Hours passed, the sun moving across the sky, and when I finally stepped back, my hands were stained with color and my chest felt lighter. The painting was not pretty, but it was honest. It was the story of my pain captured in brushstrokes that didn't ask for permission. Tears streamed down my face, not of despair this time, but of release. Mary stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "There she is," she murmured. "That's the Ellie I know. The one who won't stay down no matter how hard the world tries to keep her there." That evening, as I sat in the garden with the canvas drying in the fading light, I realized I had taken the first step toward healing. The wounds were still there, the scars still raw, but I had touched the edge of something stronger than grief. I had touched resilience. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed that maybe, just maybe, there was still a future waiting for me beyond the pain. The days at Aunt Mary's house began to take on a rhythm. I would wake to the smell of coffee and oil paint, sit with her in the garden while the light was still soft, and then spend hours either sketching or quietly staring at canvases, trying to remember what it felt like to create without fear. When she suggested that I accompany her to a small local art fair in California, I hesitated at first. Crowds and conversations had become intimidating after everything I had endured. But Mary insisted, gently saying, "Sometimes healing means letting people see you again." So I went, clutching my portfolio like a shield. The fair was bustling with color and sound. Booths lined the pathways, hung with paintings, sculptures, and handmade crafts. Musicians played softly in the background while families wandered between the stalls. I felt out of place at first, unsure if I belonged in such a lively setting, but Mary encouraged me to set up a small corner with a handful of my recent works. I arranged them nervously, adjusting frames and labels, telling myself that perhaps no one would notice them anyway. It was just after lunch when it happened. I had stepped away to grab a cup of coffee, the bitter warmth grounding me as I tried to calm my nerves. Turning back toward my booth, distracted by my own thoughts, I collided with someone. The cup tipped in my hand, and before I could stop it, a splash of coffee spilled across the sleeve of a man's crisp white shirt. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I gasped, fumbling for napkins. The man looked down at the stain, then back at me. To my surprise, he didn't seem angry. Instead, he let out a small chuckle and said, "Well, that's one way to make an introduction." His voice carried a calm authority, the kind that made people turn to listen. As I dabbed at his sleeve, embarrassed beyond words, I noticed his face. He was in his early 40s, tall, with dark hair touched by a hint of gray at the temples. His eyes were sharp yet kind, and his tailored suit didn't quite match the casual atmosphere of the fair. Something about him suggested that he was not the kind of man used to going unnoticed. "I really am sorry," I repeated, stepping back. He waved it off. "Don't worry about it. Coffee stains are nothing compared to some of the things I've had to clean up in boardrooms." He glanced over my shoulder at the booth where my paintings were displayed. "Are those yours?" I froze, suddenly wishing I had never agreed to come. "Yes, but they're nothing special," I muttered. He walked past me and stopped in front of one of the canvases, a piece I had painted during a sleepless night, a swirl of deep blues and jagged strokes of red that felt like grief spilling out of me. He tilted his head, studying it carefully. "This is powerful," he said softly. Then he turned back to me. "What's the story here?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. That painting was my pain laid bare, the story of betrayal and loss, of being discarded by the people who should have loved me most. I couldn't bring myself to explain all of that to a stranger, especially not one who seemed so composed. "It's just colors," I said weakly. One corner of his mouth lifted in a knowing smile, as if he didn't believe me but didn't want to push. He extended his hand. "Damian Cole," he said. "I run an art foundation here in California. I like to meet new artists, especially the ones who don't realize how much their work matters." I shook his hand, still flustered. "Ellie," I replied simply. He lingered for another moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek business card. Handing it to me, he tapped the painting behind me and said, "Think about the question I asked. Every great piece of art has a story. Yours clearly does. One day, I'd like to hear it." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing there with the card in my hand, and the sound of his words echoing in my mind. The name printed on the card felt unfamiliar, yet weighty. Damian Cole, CEO, Cole Art Foundation. I watched him disappear into the crowd, still stunned by the brief encounter. It wasn't just his position or his confidence that unsettled me. It was the way he had looked at my painting, as though he had truly seen it. Seen me even when I tried to hide. For the rest of the day, I kept glancing at the business card, replaying his question. What's the story here? That night, back at Aunt Mary's house, I placed the card on my bedside table and stared at the ceiling. For years, my story had been buried under ridicule, betrayal, and silence. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to start telling it, if only to myself. Damian's question lingered like a challenge, one I wasn't sure I was ready to face, but one I knew I could not forget. The next morning, the fair was quieter, the weekend crowd having thinned. I sat at my little booth, rearranging the paintings to look less awkward, though I expected little attention. My eyes were still heavy from the restless night thoughts of Damian's question looping endlessly in my head. I nearly jumped when a shadow fell across the table. Looking up, I saw him again, the man in the sharp suit with coffee stains still faintly visible on his cuff. "Good morning, Ellie," Damian said with a smile that seemed more genuine than polished. "I couldn't stop thinking about one of your pieces. The one with the heavy blues and reds. I'd like to buy it." I froze, certain I had misheard. People had admired my art before in passing, but no one had asked to purchase a piece so directly, especially not one of my most personal works. You want to buy it?" I stammered. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "It has weight. It feels alive in a way most art doesn't. That doesn't come from technique, it comes from truth. And your truth is worth something." I flushed my hands, fiddling with the edge of the table. "It's not really for sale," I murmured, unsure if I wanted to let go of something that held so much of my pain. He studied me for a moment, then said softly, "Then maybe let's just call it a beginning, not a transaction. Let me take you to lunch instead. No expectations, no pressure, just a conversation." I hesitated, the old voice of doubt whispering that I didn't belong in his world. But there was something about his presence that steadied me, something that made me curious despite myself. Finally, I nodded. "All right. Lunch?" We found a small cafe down the street, far from the noise of the fair. It was the kind of place with chipped mugs and walls lined with local artists' sketches. Damian ordered black coffee while I clutched my tea like a lifeline. For a moment we sat in silence, the hum of conversation around us filling the gaps. Then he leaned forward. "Tell me," he said, "what drew you to paint in the first place?" The question startled me. No one had asked me that in years. My parents had dismissed it as a hobby. My sister had mocked it as a waste of time, and Chris had never really understood it. But here was this man, a stranger, waiting patiently for an answer. I took a breath and said, "It was always the only way I knew how to express myself. Words never seemed enough. When I paint, it feels like I can finally let out everything I can't say, even the things that hurt." Damian nodded slowly, as though he understood far more than I had given him. "That makes sense. The canvas doesn't argue back. It doesn't laugh. It doesn't tell you you're not enough." His words struck me with surprising force. I studied him, curious. "You sound like you've lived that yourself." He leaned back, his gaze distant for a moment. "I have. My family thought the arts were foolish. My father believed the only real work was in finance numbers profit. When I told him I wanted to pursue art, he called me a failure before I even began. I built my company not to prove him wrong, but to prove to myself that I wasn't what he said." He looked at me, then, his eyes steady. "So yes, I know what it feels like to be dismissed by the people who are supposed to believe in you." Something softened inside me. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as Samantha's shadow, not as the discarded daughter, but as someone whose pain was understood by another human being. I sipped my tea, suddenly aware of the quiet bond forming across the table. Damian smiled gently, as though he sensed it too. He reached into his pocket, pulled out my business card from the day before, and tapped it against the table. "Keep painting, Ellie. There's something in you the world needs to see. And one day I hope you'll let me hear the story behind that canvas." When we parted, he left me standing outside the cafe with a strange new feeling, something like hope. For the first time in a long time, I believed that maybe my art, and maybe even my heart, had a place in the world after all. For several days after my lunch with Damien, I carried something new inside me, something I had not felt in years, an ember of hope. It was quiet and fragile, but it warmed me in ways I couldn't quite describe. I woke earlier each morning, brewed coffee with steadier hands, and set up my easel in Aunt Mary's garden before the sun had fully risen. With each stroke of my brush, I tried to capture that glimmer of possibility, the way his eyes had softened when he spoke of my painting, the way he had listened to me without judgment. I told myself not to expect too much. He was a CEO after all, a man with 1,000 demands on his time. If he did not call right away, it meant nothing. He was busy, important. I was simply one small artist among many. But still, I couldn't help checking my phone each evening, staring at the screen longer than I should, waiting for a message that never came. At first, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. The silence stretched from 2 days to 3, then to 5. By the end of the week, doubt was no longer just a whisper. It was a drumbeat in my chest, loud and steady, asking me the same question I had heard all my life. What if you are not enough? What I did not know then was that the silence was not entirely his choice. Somewhere across the city, in Damien's sleek office filled with glass walls and polished wood, his assistant had been scrolling through social media. She was a sharp woman, fiercely loyal, the kind of employee who believed it was her duty to protect her boss from anything that might stain his reputation. And then she saw it, my sister Samantha's post. It was a photo from a glittering gala. Samantha wore a gown that shimmered like starlight, her smile bright and practiced. But it wasn't the photo that mattered. It was the caption. In a few cutting sentences, she had woven a story about me, painting me as a source of scandal in our family. She implied that I had once created chaos, that I was unstable, dramatic, even dangerous to be associated with. She dressed her cruelty and humor as though it were a harmless family anecdote shared for entertainment. But I knew Samantha well enough to understand it for what it was, a deliberate strike. The assistant printed the post and placed it on Damien's desk. "Sir," she said carefully, "I thought you should see this. Are you sure this is someone you want associated with the foundation? Her own family doesn't speak highly of her. There could be risks." Damien studied the paper, his brow furrowing. He did not dismiss me outright. But the seed of doubt was planted. The very thing I had feared most, my family's disdain spilling into the world, had found its way into his life. And in that doubt, Damien did what many before him had done. He chose distance. He did not call. He did not stop by the fair again. He let silence take the place of connection. For me, that silence was deafening. At first, I told myself it was fine. We had only shared a lunch. I had no right to expect more. But deep down, I had felt something between us, something that went beyond casual conversation. And when that thread was cut so abruptly, it reopened wounds I thought had begun to heal. Each night, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my phone, my mind replaying the old chorus of rejection. Chris's words came back. "You're not stable." My mother's voice echoed. "No one will ever want you." Samantha's laughter rang in my ears. It was as if they had all gathered in the room, reminding me that I was foolish to believe anything different could ever happen. One evening, when the weight of it all became unbearable, I reached for my journal. The pages had always been my confessional, the only place where the truth could live unpolished. My hand shook as I wrote, "He is gone." Not with harsh words or slammed doors, but with silence. And once again, I am left wondering what I did wrong. Did I speak too much? Did I hold back too tightly? Or is it simply that my story will always be too heavy for anyone to carry? Tears blurred the ink. For a long moment, I stared at the page, feeling as though the words themselves had sealed my fate. But then, almost without thinking, I picked up the pen again. This time the words came slower, steadier. No. That is what they want me to believe. That I am defined by rejection. That I am the scandal, the disappointment, the shadow. But I am more than that. Damien asked me once what the story was behind my painting. Maybe the story is not just pain. Maybe the story is survival. I am still here, still painting, still standing even when they want me to fall. I closed the journal and pressed it to my chest, breathing deeply. The ache remained, but so did something else, a faint ember that would not go out. My family could spread lies. Damien could falter. The world could turn its back. But I still had the brush. I still had the canvas. And as long as I could hold on to that, I would not let the story end with their rejection. That night, I pulled out a fresh canvas. My hand trembled as I dipped the brush into paint, but I forced the first stroke onto the surface. It was jagged, uncertain, but it was mine. With every color I laid down, I felt the silence loosen its grip. I wasn't painting for Damien or for Samantha or for anyone else who had doubted me. I was painting for myself, and that I realized was something no rumor, no silence could ever take away. After the silence from Damien and the sting of my sister's online cruelty, I knew I needed something to anchor me beyond the canvas in Aunt Mary's garden. Painting alone was healing, but it wasn't enough. My life could not just be about surviving what my family had done to me. I needed to give that survival a purpose. Aunt Mary, perceptive as always, suggested I consider sharing my gift with others. "You've carried your pain into your art, Ellie," she told me one evening as she rinsed her brushes. "Maybe now it's time to help others carry theirs into something beautiful too." Her words stayed with me. A week later, I found myself walking into the modest community center downtown. It smelled faintly of chalk and disinfectant. Its walls painted a cheerful yellow that did little to hide the scuffs of age. In the back was a room with folding tables, mismatched chairs, and a wall of windows that let in generous light. The director, a kind woman with tired eyes, told me they had always wanted to offer an art class for the children who came after school but never had the resources. I offered to volunteer, and she accepted without hesitation. The first day, only 4 children showed up. They sat shyly at the tables, their pencils clutched like foreign objects. I passed out sheets of paper and cheap crayons, my voice trembling, as I asked them to draw whatever came to mind. One boy scribbled angry lines of black. A little girl drew her family, and others sketched flowers that looked more like explosions. By the end of the hour, their eyes had softened, their chatter louder, and I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in months, I was not just painting my own pain. I was helping others transform theirs. Word spread quickly. The next week, 8 children came, then 12. Parents began to stop me in the hallway, thanking me for giving their kids a space where they could breathe. One afternoon, a small girl with bright braids tugged at my sleeve as class ended. "Miss Ellie," she whispered, "my mom says she knew you when she was younger." I smiled, expecting a pleasant story, but the girl added innocently, "She said people used to laugh at you for painting so much." The words hit me unexpectedly. For a moment, I was back in my parents' living room, hearing Samantha's voice. My mother's laughter, the dismissive comments that had once cut me to the bone. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile for the girl's sake. "Well," I told her gently, "sometimes people laugh because they don't understand. But that's okay, because look at you, you understand how wonderful it feels to create, don't you?" She nodded eagerly, and I hugged her before she skipped away. Alone in the empty classroom afterward, I let myself cry quietly. It was painful, yes, but it was also liberating to realize that their cruelty no longer held the same power over me. I had taken the very thing they mocked and turned it into something that mattered. Attendance kept growing, and with it came challenges. Supplies ran out faster than I could replace them, and I often found myself spending from my meager savings just to keep the class alive. Still, I refused to stop. I bought brushes from thrift stores, begged paint donations from local shops, and stretched every dollar until it squeaked. There was joy in their little hands smudged with color. Joy worth every sacrifice. Then, one afternoon, the director called me into her office. "Ellie," she said, smiling broadly, "we just received a grant from a local arts foundation. Enough to cover supplies for the year, maybe even more. They specifically mentioned supporting your class." I blinked in surprise, my heart racing. "A grant from who?" She shrugged. They didn't leave a name. Just a foundation letterhead and a promise to continue support if the program thrives. Gratitude washed over me, though confusion lingered. Who would quietly give such a gift without asking for recognition? That night, as I locked up the classroom and walked through the dusky streets, I thought of Damien. His words, his gaze at my painting, his question about my story. It seemed like the kind of gesture he would make, though there was no way to be certain. But whether it was Damien or someone else, the effect was the same. The children had what they needed, and I felt validated in a way I hadn't in years. The whispers of my family's insults still lingered in the corners of my mind, but they no longer dictated the narrative. I was building something with my own hands, something good and real. That evening, I returned to Aunt Mary's, my clothes flecked with paint from the kids' projects, and for the first time in a long while, I felt tired in the best possible way. Sitting at my easel, I dipped my brush and painted not from sorrow, but from gratitude. The strokes were lighter, brighter, filled with the laughter of children who believed in the magic of creation. And as the canvas came alive, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to believe in that magic again, too. The grant that saved my art class had given me a sense of quiet gratitude, but I still hadn't been able to shake the thought of Damien. His silence lingered, though the possibility that he had been behind the funding made me wonder if he was closer than I realized. That question was answered one evening when Aunt Mary found me cleaning brushes in the studio. She handed me an elegant envelope, its heavy paper embossed with gold lettering. Inside was an invitation to the annual gala hosted by the Cole Art Foundation. My heart stuttered as I read the name. Damien. I nearly declined. I wasn't sure I belonged at an event where men wore tuxedos and women glittered in gowns that cost more than my rent. But Aunt Mary insisted, pressing my shoulders with firm hands. "Ellie, this is your world too. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." So I put on the most elegant dress I could afford, simple but graceful, and walked into a ballroom shimmering with chandeliers and alive with the hum of wealth and influence. At first, I kept close to the edges, admiring the art displayed on pedestals around the room. Then I saw him. Damien stood near the center, speaking with a small circle of donors, his presence commanding but relaxed. When his eyes found mine across the crowd, something in his expression softened. He excused himself and walked toward me, his smile warm. "I'm glad you came," he said. Before I could answer, a familiar sound sliced through the air, my sister's laugh. I turned, and there they were. My parents and Samantha dressed in their finest, basking in the glow of a world they adored. My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected to face them here. Samantha's gaze landed on Damien, and recognition flashed in her eyes. I saw her straighten, smoothing her dress as she made her way toward him with calculated grace. "Damien Cole." She purred, her tone dripping with familiarity. "It's been years. Do you remember me? We met at a charity luncheon. You asked me to dinner once, but I was otherwise engaged." She tossed her hair clearly, expecting his attention. Damien's expression didn't falter, but his eyes flicked briefly toward me before he responded with polite indifference. "Vaguely," he said. "I recall the luncheon, but not much else." Then he turned back to me, dismissing Samantha as though she were little more than a stranger in the crowd. The color drained from my sister's face. She recovered quickly, plastering on a smile, but the sting of being ignored was evident. My parents, standing just behind her, shifted uncomfortably as they watched the exchange. Damien extended his hand to me. "Ellie," he said firmly, his voice carrying enough weight to draw nearby eyes. "I'd like you to meet some people tonight, but first let me introduce you properly." He took my hand, the gesture steady and deliberate, then turned toward the cluster of guests who had been watching. "This," he announced, "is Ellie. She's an extraordinary artist and a very special person to me." The room seemed to pause. My parents stared, disbelief etched into every line of their faces. Samantha's smile faltered completely, her eyes darting between Damien and me as though she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. I felt heat rush to my cheeks, a mixture of shock and pride, but Damien's grip on my hand anchored me. In that moment, all the years of being dismissed, overlooked, and compared melted into a kind of vindication I had never imagined possible. Here I was standing in the glow of chandeliers beside a man who had chosen not just to see me, but to recognize me openly without hesitation. My family, who had called my dreams trash and my love meaningless, could only watch in silence as Damien's words echoed in the grand hall. I glanced at Samantha, who stood frozen, her composure cracking. For once, she wasn't the center of admiration. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't her shadow. I was simply myself, seen, valued, and astonishingly celebrated. The night was only beginning, but already I knew it would be one I would never forget. After Damien took my hand at the gala and introduced me as someone special, the rest of the evening unfolded in a blur. Guests who had once walked past me now looked at me differently, their eyes lingering not just on Damien but on me. I felt both exposed and empowered, and though my family hovered at the edges of the room like ghosts, they no longer had the power to dim the light shining on me. Later that night, during the auction portion of the gala, the organizers set up a small stage for a live demonstration. They asked if I would be willing to paint in front of the guests. My first instinct was to decline. The idea of lifting my brush under so many watchful eyes filled me with dread. But then I saw Damien's quiet nod of encouragement and Aunt Mary's proud smile from across the room. I agreed. They placed a canvas on an easel, the lights tilting toward me. At first my hands trembled as I dipped the brush into the paint, but as the strokes began to form, the crowd faded away. I painted not for them but for myself, the way I had in Mary's garden, the way I had when I was a little girl hiding from my family's scorn. I lost myself in the colors, deep blues, swirling into bright golds, a horizon breaking into dawn. It was the story of moving from shadow into light, of choosing to rise even when you have been beaten down. By the time I stepped back, the room was silent. Then the applause began, thunderous and unrelenting. What I didn't know until the next morning was that someone in the audience had recorded the entire performance on their phone. The video appeared online overnight, and within hours it had spread far beyond the walls of the gala. Comments flooded in praise for the painting, admiration for the raw emotion in my strokes, disbelief that such talent had gone unnoticed. By noon, thousands of people had shared it, and my name was suddenly on the lips of strangers. For the first time, the world was looking at me, not as Samantha's sister or my parents' disappointment, but as an artist in my own right. The most unexpected message came not from a stranger, but from Damien's grandmother. She was a formidable woman known in the art world as a discerning collector with little patience for mediocrity. When her name appeared in the caller ID of Aunt Mary's house phone, I nearly dropped the receiver. She had watched the video, she said, and it had moved her in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "I see truth in your work, Ellie," she told me, "and truth is the rarest thing in art. I would like to meet you." I agreed, though nerves twisted in my stomach. We met at her townhouse a few days later, where every wall was lined with masterpieces from around the globe. She studied me with sharp eyes, but her voice was kind as she asked about my journey, my influences, and my dreams. When I confessed that I had often been told my art was worthless, she shook her head firmly. Worthless to them, perhaps. But to those who understand, it is priceless. Never let small minds define the scope of your gift. It was she who connected me with the curator of a prestigious gallery in San Francisco. The curator, having already seen the viral video, invited me to present a collection of my work for an upcoming exhibition. The offer felt unreal. For years, I had painted in secret my canvases hidden away like shameful secrets. Now I was being asked to share them with the world. When I told Aunt Mary, she wrapped me in her arms, tears bright in her eyes. "Do you see, Ellie? This is what happens when you refuse to let them silence you. This is the life that was always meant for you." That night, alone in my room, I stood before the mirror holding Damien's business card in one hand and the gallery's invitation in the other. My heart beat with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I had always dreamed of this kind of recognition, but I had never believed it could be mine. Yet now, because I had dared to keep painting, because I had chosen to survive, the door to a new world had opened. I picked up my journal and wrote, "For once, the story is not about what I have lost, but what I am about to gain. They tried to bury me, but I am beginning to bloom." And as I closed the book, I knew that the next chapter of my life was about to be written not in silence, but in color, bold enough for the world to see. The weeks after the viral video and the invitation to the gallery passed in a haze of preparation and disbelief. I painted with a renewed urgency, pouring every ounce of myself into the canvases I would soon unveil to the public. Damien was there through it all, sometimes quietly watching me work, sometimes offering a word of encouragement, or bringing me a cup of tea late at night when exhaustion threatened to overtake me. His presence was steady, never demanding, never pressing for more than I could give. For the first time in my life, I felt the warmth of being supported without condition. The night of the gallery showing was unlike anything I had ever imagined. The walls of the exhibition hall glowed with my work, the colors dancing beneath the soft lights. People wandered from piece to piece, murmuring their impressions, pausing to look at the stories I had once believed too shameful to share. Damien stood beside me, his hand brushing mine occasionally, his pride clear in his eyes. I thought that evening would be the pinnacle of everything, but Damien had other plans. After the crowd began to thin, he guided me to a quieter corner of the gallery. A single canvas stood there, blank and untouched, framed and waiting as though for a future story yet to be told. In front of it was a small table set with candles and a bottle of wine. The lights dimmed slightly, and for a moment I thought it was simply another gesture of kindness, another reminder that I had more stories to paint. Then Damien turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Ellie." He began, his voice steady but softer than I had ever heard it. "The first time I saw your work, I knew it was born from something deeper than technique. It was truth. And from that truth, I saw you. I've watched you fight your way back to yourself, and I've fallen in love with every step you've taken. Tonight, I don't want to just celebrate your art. I want to celebrate you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring that sparkled in the dim light. "Will you marry me?" My breath caught in my chest. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still around me. The part of me that had longed for love, that had dreamed of a future where I was cherished rather than mocked, wanted to say yes immediately. Yet another part, the part that still bore the scars of betrayal, abandonment, and ridicule, froze. The ring glittered like a promise, but behind it lurked all the fears I had not yet conquered. Tears welled in my eyes as I whispered, "Damien, I can't. Not yet." His brow furrowed slightly, but there was no anger, no disappointment in his gaze. Only patience. "Tell me why," he said gently. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. "I want to say yes, but there are still pieces of me that feel broken, still echoes of their voices in my head. If I say yes now, it will be from a place of fear, not freedom, and you deserve more than that. We both do." Damien closed the box slowly, then reached out and took my hand in his. "Ellie, I don't need an answer tonight. I don't even need it tomorrow. What I need is you in whatever way you can give yourself. If that means waiting, I'll wait. If it means building something slowly, brick by brick, then that's what we'll do. I don't want the perfect version of you. I want the real you, however long it takes." His words broke something open inside me, not with pain, but with relief. He wasn't asking me to be healed overnight, nor was he asking me to bury my wounds. He was asking only for honesty and the courage to walk beside him. For the first time, love did not feel like a demand. It felt like a promise of patience. Later that night, when I returned home, I opened my journal. My hand shook as I wrote, but the words came clear. Tonight, I was asked to be someone's forever. My heart wanted to leap, but my scars held me back. And yet he didn't turn away. He didn't scold me for being too afraid. He simply promised to wait to love me the right way. I am terrified. I am hopeful. I am both at once. But for the first time, I think I might believe that love is not something to fear. It is something I can grow into. I closed the book, pressing it to my chest, and let myself breathe deeply. The ring might remain in its box for now, but the seed of a future had been planted. And unlike before, I knew this time I had the strength to let it bloom in its own time. After Damien's proposal and my trembling refusal, we settled into a rhythm of something quieter, but no less meaningful. He kept his word, never pressing me for answers I wasn't ready to give, never making me feel rushed toward a future I still needed time to accept. Yet love in its patient form began to weave itself between us anyway. Weeks turned into months, and the gallery exhibition blossomed into opportunities I could barely comprehend. Through it all, Damien stayed near, steady as stone, until one evening he arrived with an idea that would change everything. We were sitting on the terrace of Aunt Mary's house, the air cool with the coming fall. Damien leaned back in his chair watching me sip tea. Then he said, almost casually, "Ellie, what if we planned a wedding our way? Quiet, private, away from cameras, away from your family's gossip, away from everyone who ever tried to tell you that you weren't enough." His eyes met mine, steady and serious now. "I want you to have the kind of day you once dreamed of in your backyard, only this time in a place where no one can mock it. Just us, and the people who truly matter." My chest tightened, remembering my first dream of lanterns and wildflowers, a dream my family had ridiculed into ashes. "But Damien," I said softly, "the media follows you everywhere. They'll never let us have that." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "There are ways. A private estate contracts that bind every guest and vendor to silence. Non-disclosure agreements are tedious, yes, but they give us control. We can make this ours." He reached for my hand. "Ellie, will you trust me to protect this with you?" I thought about it for a long moment. The girl I once was would have said yes without hesitation, desperate for approval. But the woman I was becoming weighed the offer, considered what it meant to finally live free of the scrutiny that had scarred me. At last, I nodded. "Yes, I'll trust you." The next week, lawyers arrived with a stack of papers. Damien explained each clause patiently, making sure I understood that signing meant silence, not just from the vendors, but from me too. For once, the silence would serve me, not destroy me. I signed the NDA with a firm hand, a strange satisfaction flooding me as I realized I was choosing privacy on my own terms. With that step complete, Damien urged me to begin the part that mattered most, designing my gown. I turned to Aunt Mary, who had always stitched clothes with the same care she gave her canvases. Together we pored over fabrics, sketches, and delicate lace. There was no talk of Samantha's hand-me-downs, no mocking laughter about what was good enough. This time each thread and each seam was chosen with love. We worked late into the night, Mary guiding me my fingers, learning to shape something that belonged wholly to me. The gown that emerged was not extravagant by society's standards, but it was exquisite in its honesty. Simple silk with embroidered wildflowers curling at the hem, like the ones I had once imagined in my backyard. While we worked, whispers grew louder outside. The press began to circle Damien's world like hawks, sensing that something monumental was unfolding. Anonymous sources spoke of a wedding of the year of preparations so secretive that not even the staff at Damien's own offices knew the full details. Headlines speculated endlessly. Who was the mystery bride? Some suggested a Hollywood actress, others a European heiress. Social media buzzed with theories, each wilder than the last. But no one guessed the truth that the woman they were all hunting was a quiet painter who once taught children in a scuffed community center classroom. At night, Damien would show me the tabloids with a wry smile, and I would laugh despite myself. If only they knew I'd say tracing the outlandish stories with my finger. But beneath the laughter was something else, a mix of fear and exhilaration. Fear that somehow my family would discover the truth and twist it into another weapon. Exhilaration that for once I was at the center of a story I had authored, not one written at my expense. As the weeks passed, the pieces of the plan fell into place. The estate Damien had chosen was a sprawling vineyard tucked into the rolling hills of Napa Valley, hidden behind gates and guarded by contracts. The invitations went out quietly, hand-delivered to a select few marry the children from my art class and Damien's grandmother, who insisted on being there. The rest of the world was left to speculate wildly, none the wiser. Each night as I folded fabric swatches or pressed embroidery into the gown's hem, I felt something in me settle. This was not about erasing the wounds of my past. It was about building something new atop them, brick by brick, with someone who had promised to wait until I was ready. And though the world outside buzzed with noise inside the quiet circle we had drawn for ourselves, I finally felt what I had long thought impossible: peace. As the wedding plans began to take shape, the question of who would be there hung over us like a shadow. We had already chosen the estate, the gown was nearly finished under Aunt Mary's careful hands, and the contracts with vendors had been signed. Everything felt secure, private, intentional. But one evening, while we sat together in Damien's study with a list of names spread across the desk, he looked at me and asked the question I had been dreading. "Ellie, do you want to invite your family?" The words made my chest tighten. For a moment, I imagined what it would be like to see them seated at long tables beneath twinkling lights, pretending to smile as though the years of ridicule and betrayal had never happened. I imagined my mother's critical gaze, my father's dismissive silence, Samantha's smugness. The thought alone was enough to sour the sweetness of everything Damien and I had built together. I set down the pen I had been holding and met Damien's eyes. "No," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "They're not my family anymore. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. And they've never given me that." Damien studied me carefully, his expression unreadable at first. Then he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "I needed to hear you say that for yourself," he said. "It's your day, Ellie. No one gets to stand beside you unless you want them there." The decision felt like a release. For so long, my choices had been shaped by what my parents wanted, what Samantha demanded, what others expected. Saying no was more than just excluding them from a list. It was declaring that I no longer lived under their shadow. When it came time to decide who would take their place, the answer came easily. "I want Mary there." "Of course," I said, glancing at my aunt, who smiled with tears in her eyes. "And the children from my art class. They've given me more joy than I ever thought possible. They've taught me that love can be simple, pure, and real. They're the ones who matter." So we wrote their names carefully onto the list. Small hands that had once clutched crayons in my classroom would now carry flower petals and laughter down the aisle. Their presence would be my reminder that family is chosen, not dictated. Still, Damien was not a man who ignored the complexities of life. A few nights later, as we reviewed the growing pile of logistics, he said quietly, "Ellie, I won't invite them. That's your choice, and I respect it fully. But I think they should know. Not because they deserve a seat, but because it will matter when they realize what they've lost. I'll make sure the news reaches them not through us, but through the media they care about so much." At first, the idea made me uneasy. The last thing I wanted was another tabloid circus centered on my family. But then I thought of how often they had paraded Samantha's triumphs in public while dismissing me in private. Perhaps this was the balance the universe owed. I nodded slowly. As long as they're not part of the day, I don't care how they find out. True to his word, Damien set things in motion quietly. A carefully chosen leak slipped into the right hands enough to stir the press without giving away too much. Soon the speculation about the wedding of the year grew wilder, but always cloaked in secrecy. Insiders whispered about the lavish estate, the stringency of the contracts, the mystery surrounding the bride. And somewhere in the swirl of gossip, my parents and Samantha learned the truth in the only way they valued through headlines and rumor. I imagined their faces when they read it. My father's disbelief, my mother's sharp intake of breath, Samantha's fury that I, the one they had always called lesser, was at the center of the story now. The thought didn't bring me guilt. Instead, it gave me an unexpected calm. This was not revenge in the loud, destructive sense. It was justice, clean and silent. As the guest list settled into something small and sacred, I felt a new kind of certainty grow within me. This was not just a wedding. It was the creation of a family I had chosen, one built from love, patience, and the people who had truly seen me. For once, my life was not a performance for those who mocked me. It was a celebration for those who cherished me. And that I realized was the truest form of victory. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the vineyard estate in Napa Valley transformed into a hidden sanctuary. Vines heavy with fruit framed the rolling hills, and white tents rose in elegant rows across the grounds. Despite the secrecy of our plans, the outside world buzzed louder each day. Headlines speculated endlessly about the wedding of the year. Photos of delivery trucks pulling through the estate gates were snapped by paparazzi camped on distant roads, and rumors swirled about the guest list, the menu, the musicians. Yet somehow, no one had managed to uncover the one detail that mattered most, the identity of the bride. One evening, as Damien and I walked through the lantern-lit courtyard where guests would soon gather, he paused and looked at me with a spark in his eyes. "Ellie, I've been thinking about how you should arrive," he said. "You deserve more than simply stepping out of a carriage or walking across the lawn. This is your moment. I want the world to see you the way I see you." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "And how do you see me?" He smiled, the kind of smile that melted away the fear still tucked into my heart. As someone unforgettable, someone who cannot be ignored. With that, he unveiled his idea. I would arrive in a gleaming vintage Rolls-Royce restored to perfection, its polished surface reflecting the flash of cameras waiting beyond the estate's gates. Security would keep the press at a distance, but the sight of the car alone carrying the bride no one had yet identified would fuel a frenzy of attention. Inside the grounds, as the car rolled slowly toward the aisle, the photographers permitted in would capture every step I took. It would be an entrance designed not out of vanity, but out of vindication. At first, the extravagance unsettled me. For so long I had wanted simplicity to slip quietly into happiness without spectacle. But then I remembered the years of being brushed aside, laughed at, erased. I remembered the night Samantha's yacht engagement had eclipsed the small wedding I had dreamed of. I remembered my mother calling my plans trash. The thought of finally standing in the center, not as an afterthought but as the bride everyone wanted to see, made something deep inside me stir. I let out a laugh, quiet at first, then freer. "You're right," I said, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. "This time no one will be able to pretend I don't exist. No one will be able to look away." In that moment, I felt the old wounds shift into strength. I wasn't planning the entrance to impress my family or to gloat. I was planning it for myself, to reclaim the dignity they had tried to strip away from me. As the final week approached, the speculation outside grew wilder. Reporters camped near the estate claimed the bride must be a celebrity flown in under the cover of night. Some whispered about a European princess, others about a Hollywood actress too private to announce her engagement. None of them considered that the woman at the center of it all had once taught children to paint with crayons in a battered classroom. Every morning, glossy magazines carried new stories about the mysterious preparations. The billionaire's secret bride read one headline. "Who will walk into Napa's golden vineyard?" another teased. Talk shows devoted entire segments to guessing games, pulling photos of Damien standing beside models, philanthropists, and actresses, pairing him with anyone but the woman he had truly chosen. And still the truth remained hidden, wrapped in silence and a stack of ironclad contracts. Inside the estate walls, Aunt Mary and I adjusted the gown's final details. As I stood before the mirror in the simple silk embroidered with wildflowers, I barely recognized myself. Not because the dress made me someone else, but because for the first time I saw a woman who had survived every cruel word, every abandonment, and had still chosen to stand tall. One afternoon, as we rehearsed my entrance with the car, I stepped onto the gravel driveway in my gown, the sun catching on the embroidery. The car door closed behind me with a dignified click, and I walked slowly toward the archway where the ceremony would take place. The staff gathered to assist paused to watch. For a moment, silence filled the vineyard. Then someone whispered, "She looks like she belongs here." Belonging. It was a word that once felt foreign to me, as though it belonged to others but never to myself. Yet now, with Damien's plan for my arrival and the world clamoring outside without knowing my name, I felt that belonging take root in my bones. The night before the wedding, Damien and I sat together on the terrace, the estate glowing with anticipation around us. Tomorrow, he said, his fingers brushing mine, the world will still wonder. But I'll know. And that's all that matters. I smiled, remembering the laughter I had once stifled in silence. "Let them wonder," I said softly. "Because tomorrow the wondering ends. Tomorrow they'll see me." And I knew that when I stepped out of that vintage car into the light of cameras and the awe of strangers, I would not just be making an entrance. I would be rewriting the story of my life. The morning after Damien revealed his plan for my grand entrance, the vineyard estate seemed to hum with quiet purpose. Workers moved discreetly across the grounds, stringing lanterns between the oak trees and arranging long tables under white canopies. Though the gates remained closed and security kept prying eyes far away, there was no mistaking the scale of what was being prepared. This was no ordinary wedding. This was an event meant to rival the extravagance of the world's most celebrated unions, yet hidden behind layers of secrecy so thick that even the guests had only fragments of information. Damien had insisted the ceremony be held outdoors among the sweeping hills of Napa Valley. Nature will frame the vows better than any cathedral, he had said, and I could not disagree. The estate he had chosen stretched for acres, its vineyards glowing gold in the late afternoon light, its stone terraces offering views that felt eternal. Every angle was designed for beauty, every path leading to a space where something unforgettable would happen. But perhaps the boldest decision came not from the setting, but from Damien's choice to allow the wedding to be live-streamed. The idea startled me when he first mentioned it. Streamed. For the whole world to see, I asked, my heart leaping with both fear and awe. "Yes," he answered calmly, "but only on our terms. We'll partner with one of the major networks. They'll film it as an exclusive. Millions will watch, but no one, not one single person, will know who the bride is until the moment you step out of that car." It was a gamble, one that leaned into the frenzy the media had already created. By then, the rumors had grown louder than ever. Headlines spoke breathlessly of the most secretive wedding in Silicon Valley history, speculating endlessly about the identity of Damien's bride. Tabloids had paired his name with actresses, models, and heiresses, each article more outrageous than the last. The mystery only fueled the hype, and Damien, with the precision of a strategist, chose to turn that attention into a stage. "You once told me no one would ever be able to ignore you again," he reminded me. "This is how we make that promise true. You'll reveal yourself when you're ready in front of a world that once doubted you." Despite the nerves twisting in my stomach, I found myself nodding. There was power in the thought of it, power in the secrecy, power in the reveal. For so long, my story had been one of humiliation whispered behind closed doors. Now the unveiling of my happiness would happen under the open sky with the nation watching. While Damien coordinated with networks and security teams, I focused on something far more personal: the dress. Aunt Mary and I had spent months working on it in the quiet of her studio. It was unlike the glittering gowns Samantha might have chosen, unlike the fashion spreads I saw in the magazines speculating about me. Instead, it was deeply mine. A column of silk, soft and flowing, adorned with wildflowers embroidered along the hem. Each stitch had been sewn by hand, some by Mary, some by me. Late at night, we would sit side by side, her glasses perched low on her nose, her hands steady while mine trembled at first. She would tell me stories of her youth, of her own small rebellions against family expectations, and together we wove those stories into the threads of the gown. The final fitting came just days before the wedding. As I stepped into the dress and turned toward the mirror, silence filled the room. For a long moment, even Mary said nothing. Then her eyes shimmered with tears. "Ellie," she whispered, her voice unsteady, "you've never looked more yourself." She was right. The gown was not a disguise or a costume. It was a reflection. It carried the simplicity I had always cherished, the artistry I had fought to defend, the resilience I had earned. When I walked down that aisle, I would not just be a bride. I would be the culmination of every wound, every survival, every choice to rise when I could have fallen. Outside the estate walls, the chatter reached a fever pitch. The network released teasers of the live stream showing the sweeping vineyard without revealing the preparations inside. The Billionaire's Bride Mystery, one headline declared. Another asked, "Will the world finally learn who Damian Cole has chosen?" Viewers marked their calendars. Talk shows speculated, betting pools formed over names that had nothing to do with me. Inside, though, the air was calm. Each day, as Mary adjusted the gown's hem, or Damian finalized guest details, I felt a strange peace settle over me. The secrecy, the anticipation, the hum of the press, it all swirled outside like a storm. But within our circle, everything was steady. For once, I was not scrambling for scraps of approval. I was preparing to walk into the light on my own terms, with the love of the people who mattered most. The night before the wedding, I stood alone in the courtyard, lanterns glowing above me, the vineyard stretching like an ocean of gold around me. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, the scent of earth and grapes grounding me. Tomorrow the cameras would roll. The world would watch, and I would step into a story I had once believed impossible. But tonight, for one fleeting moment, I let myself simply be Ellie, the girl who had once dreamed of wildflowers in her backyard, now standing on the edge of a new life, her gown waiting her moment nearly here. On the very same afternoon that the vineyard glowed in preparation for my arrival, my family gathered far away aboard Samantha's latest stage of grandeur. She had insisted on hosting what she called her second wedding celebration, a lavish party on a yacht anchored just off the coast. Guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits sipped champagne music, drifted across the waves, and Samantha stood at the center, as always, basking in the applause. My parents hovered close, their pride evident as they toasted to her brilliance, convinced they were once again aligned with the daughter who mattered most. The yacht's lounge was adorned with flat-screen televisions, each tuned to the network covering Damian's wedding. The broadcast had been marketed for weeks as an unprecedented event, the wedding of one of the world's most eligible billionaires, a man whose empire stretched from tech to art. The only mystery was the identity of his bride. The speculation had entertained Samantha's guests for days, each one eager to see who might stand at Damian's side. Samantha herself smirked when asked, claiming she had once been acquainted with him, though she added dismissively, "Whoever it is, she won't compare to me." The broadcast began with sweeping shots of Napa Valley cameras gliding over the vineyard bathed in sunlight. A hush fell over the yacht's party as waiters turned up the volume. Even Samantha leaned forward, eager, expecting to critique some stranger's appearance. The announcer's voice filled the room, smooth and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what promises to be the wedding of the year. The groom is Damian Cole, CEO and philanthropist, a man whose brilliance and fortune have captivated the world. And today at last, we will meet his bride." Guests gasped as the camera cut to a vintage Rolls-Royce gliding along the gravel path of the estate. The sun glinted off its polished surface, and anticipation rippled across both the nation and the yacht. My mother's smile faltered slightly. My father leaned forward. Samantha rolled her eyes unimpressed. But then the car slowed to a stop. The chauffeur opened the door, and when I stepped out, the world seemed to still. The cameras caught every detail: the silk gown embroidered with wildflowers, the quiet strength in my posture, the calm in my eyes. I looked nothing like the discarded daughter they had dismissed. I looked radiant, luminous, as though the vineyard itself had been waiting for me. On the yacht, silence crashed down. Glasses hung frozen in midair. Conversations died on lips. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father muttered a curse under his breath. And Samantha, standing rigid in her glittering gown, stared in disbelief as her younger sister, the one she had always called lesser, was revealed as the bride of a $12 billion CEO. For a long moment, the only sound was the announcer's voice, brimming with awe. And there she is, the bride who has remained a mystery until this very moment. Across the country, living rooms erupted with gasps and cheers. Viewers who had once pitied or ignored me now saw me transformed, stepping into a destiny no one could have predicted. On the yacht, panic began to stir. Samantha fumbled for her phone, her carefully painted smile trembling. She dialed Damien's number with frantic fingers, her voice sharp as she hissed, "This has to be a mistake. He knows me. He remembers me. He can't possibly." But when the line went straight to voicemail and the second attempt was met with a blocked message, her composure cracked. "He blocked me." She whispered the words, tasting like ash. Around her, the guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to comfort or to gawk at her humiliation. My parents stared at the television, their faces pale, as if they were witnessing the collapse of a world they had built on Samantha's superiority. Meanwhile, the broadcast showed Damien waiting at the altar, his gaze fixed only on me as I walked slowly down the path, cameras capturing each step. The crowd of invited guests, children from my art class mentors and loved ones, rose to their feet in applause. The announcer spoke again, his voice trembling with excitement. "The nation has speculated for weeks, and now the truth is here. She is no heiress, no celebrity, no royal. She is Ellie Thompson, an artist whose work has already touched hearts across the country. And today, she marries Damien Cole." The declaration rang out across America, and in that moment, I was no longer invisible. People saw me not as the forgotten daughter or the overshadowed sister, but as a woman who had endured and risen. The revelation rippled outward, sparking admiration, envy, and disbelief in equal measure. Back on the yacht, Samantha's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the deck. She turned away from the screen, her face contorted with rage and disbelief. My mother tried to speak, but no words came. My father reached for another drink, his jaw tight, his pride crumbling. Around them, the celebration of Samantha's supposed triumph withered, replaced by the undeniable reality flashing across every television in America. The daughter they had discarded was the one who had captured the heart of a man the world revered. I did not see their reactions firsthand. I was too focused on the path before me, on Damien's eyes waiting at the altar, on the quiet thrill of finally stepping into a future I had claimed for myself. But somewhere deep inside I knew. I knew they were watching, powerless, forced to witness my happiness from the outside. And for the first time in my life, it was not me looking through the glass longing to belong. It was them. The moment my face appeared on the broadcast, the weight of years seemed to lift from my shoulders. I could almost feel the shockwaves moving outward the country, realizing who Damien's bride truly was. But just as the music swelled and I prepared to walk further down the aisle, Damien's hand brushed mine lightly. He had a small smile, but in his eyes was a hint of warning. I looked down, and in the discreet space of my bouquet, I saw my phone buzzing. Against my better judgment, I glanced at the screen. It was a message from my father. The words were simple, almost pitiful in their sudden change of tone. "Can we come in?" Just 4 words, but loaded with desperation. The very man who had once told me that no one would ever want me now begged for entry into the most sacred day of my life. My throat tightened, not with longing, but with the kind of clarity that comes only after years of pain. I thought back to the countless moments I had stood outside their circles looking in. To the dinners where my ideas were dismissed, to the nights when Samantha was celebrated while I was forgotten, to the day they cut me off and said I was not worth investing in. And now they wanted a seat at my table. It might have been easy to crumble to offer them a place out of habit, out of some leftover hunger for belonging. But that girl no longer lived in me. Without a second thought, I tapped the keyboard and sent a single reply, the laughing face with tears streaming down. It was not cruel so much as honest. It said everything I needed without wasting breath. "You are too late." Damien caught the movement and leaned close. "What did they say?" he asked softly, careful not to let the cameras pick up our exchange. I tilted the phone slightly so he could see, then locked it and slid it back into my bouquet. "They asked to come in," I said. My voice was calm, almost serene. "I told them no. I don't need them anymore." His smile deepened and he squeezed my hand. "Good," he whispered, "because you have everything you need right here." For the first time in years, I felt the truth of those words. I did not need my parents' reluctant approval or Samantha's fleeting attention. I had my aunt's unwavering support, the children who had cheered me on, the love of a man who had seen me at my lowest and still chosen me. That was family. That was enough. The music swelled again, cueing me forward. My focus shifted from the screen in my bouquet to the aisle lined with flowers, to the faces of those who had come to celebrate love rather than status. The cameras tracked every movement, and I knew millions were watching. But the thought did not frighten me. It empowered me. For once, the attention was not something stolen or mocked. It was freely given, and I had earned it. I could hear the soft murmur of the crowd as I walked, the quiet gasp when the train of my gown caught the light, the sigh when Damien's gaze locked with mine. In the corner of my vision, the broadcast cameras pivoted, capturing each step, each detail. Somewhere in living rooms across America, people whispered my name in surprise. Somewhere on that yacht, my family sat paralyzed, barred from entry, forced to watch as I lived the happiness they had denied me. When I reached the altar, Damien extended his hand, steady and sure. My fingers slipped into his, and the last vestiges of fear fell away. He looked at me as though no one else existed, as though the millions of viewers and the noise of speculation were just background to the truth of us standing there together. I glanced briefly toward Aunt Mary, who dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her smile radiant. Beyond her sat the children from my class, their small faces glowing with excitement, clutching wildflower bouquets they had helped gather. In that instant, I understood the depth of what I had gained. This was not a day defined by who was absent. It was defined by who had chosen to show up. The officiant's voice rose above the music, welcoming those gathered and those watching from afar. As he spoke, I let my mind settle on the vows I was about to give. Words of commitment, of faith, of love, forged not in ease, but in trial. My father's message, my mother's silence, Samantha's anger, none of it mattered now. What mattered was the promise I would make, not for spectacle, not for validation, but for the future Damien and I were ready to build. Standing there, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The laughter I had sent in that single emoji was more than a dismissal. It was a declaration that the past no longer held me hostage, and as I prepared to speak the words that would bind me to Damien before the world, I realized that my truest revenge was not shutting them out. It was standing here whole, unbroken, radiant in spite of them. They could watch, but they could never belong, and that, I thought with a quiet smile, was enough. The music softened and the officiant paused, giving a small nod to the production crew stationed discreetly along the vineyard's stone terrace. The network had planned a brief live segment between the procession and the vows, a way to fold the story of the day into the broadcast without stealing the ceremony's intimacy. A camera light warmed to life, and the host, calm, respectful, stepped forward with a handheld mic. Her voice lowered to match the hush of the crowd. She invited Damien's grandmother to join her for a few words. Damien squeezed my hand before gently releasing it, and I watched his grandmother rise from her seat with the poise of someone who had lived in the art world's front row and yet never lost her gentleness. She stood by the host, but her eyes sought me first, holding mine with a generosity that eased the quickened beat of my heart. When the host asked what had drawn her to my work, the older woman did not speak like a dealer naming prices or a critic charting movements. She spoke like someone remembering light returning to a dim room. "I have seen great paintings in great rooms," she began, her voice clear enough to carry but soft enough to settle on the vines. "I have stood before masterpieces and admired their genius. But when I first saw Ellie's work, I did not admire. I felt. There was something in the way she holds sorrow and hope on the same canvas that helped me breathe on days when breathing was not easy." The host prompted gently. "You've called her work healing. What did you mean by that?" "I lost my oldest friend last year," she said simply. Nothing anyone said could comfort me. But one afternoon, I watched a short clip of Ellie painting. She wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to tell the truth. I sat there and let the colors move through me, and for the first time since the funeral, I cried without fear. That is what healing looks like. It is not forgetting. It is remembering with less terror. Ellie's paintings did that for me. She turned back to the camera lens as if speaking to a distant familiar face. "We collect art for many reasons. If you are fortunate, you collect a piece that gives you yourself back. Ellie's work did that for me." I felt the crowd lean closer in a collective exhale. The host thanked her. She returned to her seat, and as she did, she pressed my fingers with a conspirator's wink, a quiet blessing only we shared. The host then invited Damien to speak. He came forward with unhurried steps, not as a man accustomed to microphones and headlines, but as a person who understood that words can either bruise or shelter, and he meant to do the latter. "People assume a life like mine is built out of decisive moments," he said, gaze steady, voice unforced. "Numbers deals deadlines. Maybe that's true. But the moment that changed me didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened at a dusty fair under a striped tent, where a stranger's canvas stopped me cold. I didn't know who she was, but I knew the honesty in those strokes. Later, when I learned her name, we sat with coffee and silence, and I realized I wasn't just seeing art. I was meeting the person I had been moving toward for years without knowing it." The host tilted her head. "You've called Ellie your destiny. That's a strong word for a careful man." He smiled, and I recognized the private curve of it, the one that never performed. "Destiny isn't a thunderclap," he said. "Sometimes it's the gentle hand that steadies you when the world is loud." I watched Ellie refuse to be defined by cruelty. I watched her choose the smallest children and the quietest rooms and make beauty there. I saw the cost of that courage, and I saw that she kept choosing it. So yes, destiny. Not because it was inevitable, but because I chose her and she kept choosing herself. That is the only miracle I believe in. Applause rose and fell like a tide, and with it came a hush, as if the vineyard itself was listening. The host turned to me last. I had not planned to speak, but the camera's red light was not a demand. It was an invitation. I stepped toward the mic, felt the fabric of my gown settle at my ankles, and gathered every piece of the road that had brought me to this arch of flowers and sky. "I used to think I had to earn my way into love," I said. "I thought if I was quiet enough, pleasing enough, useful enough, I would be welcomed. When that didn't happen, I learned to make myself small to survive. Art was the one place I didn't have to shrink. On canvas, I could tell the truth and live through it." I glanced at the rows of faces, my aunt with her damp handkerchief, the children sitting up very straight, the crew holding still as statues. To anyone watching who has been told that your dreams are silly or your love is insufficient, I want you to hear me. You are not defined by the people who could not see you. The host asked softly, "What does this day mean to you, beyond the vows?" I looked at Damien, then back at the lens that carried me into living rooms and hospital rooms and quiet kitchens across the country. It means I am not carrying the old weight anymore, I said. I am not asking anyone to change for me, and I am not changing to be chosen. Forgiveness isn't about making other people different. Forgiveness is how you put down the burden so you can be free. I forgave so I could walk here without bitterness in my mouth, not to rewrite their story but to reclaim mine. The words landed in the stillness like a bell. I hadn't rehearsed them, but I knew them as surely as I knew the feel of a brush in my hand. The host thanked us and closed the segment with the grace the moment deserved, her voice threading the broadcast back into the ceremony. The camera lights dimmed. The crew lowered their gear. Around us, the ordinary sounds of a wedding returned: the rustle of silk, the soft laugh of a child, a breeze lifting a veil edge and letting it fall again. Damien rejoined me at the altar, and the officiant stepped forward with a quiet smile that said, "Now we begin." I watched a sparrow dart between vines, watched a late sun leave honey on the hills, and felt the calm of having told the truth in daylight. The past could stand where it wished on a yacht on a couch in the mind of someone who preferred shadows, but it could not follow me into this vow. I reached for Damien's hands. His fingers were warm, his eyes unguarded. The red tally light was gone, but I felt for once no need of an audience. We had already said the most important part aloud, that love chosen freely is its own freedom. That forgiveness is not a prize you hand to the undeserving, but a door you open for yourself. The officiant asked us to speak our promises. As I began, I carried with me not the old ache, but a quiet certainty I had stepped out from under the gaze that measured and found me lacking. I had looked into a lens and given back a different reflection. And now, with the world listening or not listening as it pleased, I would say yes to a life I had finally learned to claim. The vows were spoken under a lace of late sunlight, and when the officiant pronounced us married, the vineyard seemed to release a breath it had been holding for years. Music rose, glasses chimed, and people I loved gathered like a warm ring around us. I moved through it all as if the ground had softened beneath my feet. After the first dance and a few photographs, Damien touched my elbow and murmured that he wanted a minute alone. He led me off the terrace past the strings of lanterns and the laughter to a small stone library at the edge of the estate, where the air smelled faintly of leather and dust. He closed the door behind us, and the sounds of celebration dimmed. On a narrow table sat a thin folder, the sort of thing one brings to a meeting, not a wedding. He glanced at it, then at me, his expression gentle, but intent. "I've been holding this until today," he said quietly. "Not because I wanted to mix business with our wedding, but because I wanted you to hear it from me when you were ready to carry it without it hurting." I felt a tremor of old caution. "What is it?" He didn't open the folder right away. Instead, he took my hands, thumbs brushing the base of my fingers where my ring rested. "Last winter, he began your father's company was days from defaulting on its credit line. Vendors were pulling back. The bank was preparing covenants you couldn't unwind, and payroll looked uncertain. It wasn't just numbers, it was jobs, retirement accounts, mortgages tied to those jobs. It was a small world about to crack." I went very still. So much had happened to me inside my own hurt, I hadn't asked many questions about the steady hum of my parents' lives. This was the first time anyone had given shape to the rumors I'd heard, and then learned to ignore to save my sanity. "How do you know that I asked?" "Because I made sure it didn't crack," he said. He opened the folder and slid it toward me. Clean pages, a brief memo, a chart of ownership that showed unfamiliar names. Redwood Bridge Capital took a controlling stake through a bridge financing structure, he explained. They restructured the debt, negotiated new terms with the bank, and stabilized cash flow. They brought in a quiet operator to help on the ops side. Redwood Bridge is one of the satellite funds I control. My name is nowhere on the documents. I looked up, searching his face. He held my gaze without flinching. Why? The word felt too small for the swells moving through me. Surprise, relief, anger that I didn't want, gratitude that I did. He answered as if we had all the time in the world. Because letting it fail would have punished a lot of people who never mocked you. And because I didn't want you to carry the grief of watching something collapse that had built your childhood home, even if the people inside it never chose you. I didn't do it for them. I did it for you and for the people whose names your father never brought to the table when he bragged about the company. I brushed the edge of the paper with my fingertips, feeling the cool weight of it. They don't know, I said softly, more statement than question. He shook his head. They'll never know. I don't need them to know. I only need you to know, if it matters to you. It did, more than I could say. I thought of the warehouse crew that used to wave when we drove past the lot of the office manager who brought me cookies when I was 10. I thought of my father's pride and my mother's certainty, and how both had been built on the quiet labor of people who never stood in the photographs. Somewhere in those offices, a clock had kept ticking. Paychecks had cleared and no one had panicked. They would chalk it up to your father's grit or a lucky turn. They would never give a name to the unseen hands that steadied the wheel. And somehow that felt exactly right. I set the papers down and stepped into him, resting my forehead against his chest. You could have told me months ago, I said. I could have. He agreed. But I didn't want it to feel like a counterpunch or a performance. There has been enough theater in your life. I wanted this to be quiet. A repair, not a spectacle. I thought about the years I had spent trying to be seen by people who only looked for their own reflections. How many times had I told myself that justice would arrive with noise, a gavel, a headline, and yet here it was, hushed and complete, a balance set right without a single raised voice. It wasn't vindictive. It was precise. The kind of fairness that doesn't ask permission to exist. He kissed my hair, then leaned back enough to look at me. If you're angry, tell me. I'm not, I said, surprised at the steadiness in my own voice. I'm relieved for the people whose names we don't know, and for the version of me who would have taken their pain on as proof that I didn't deserve good things. And I'm grateful that you didn't use it as a weapon. He smiled in that quiet way of his. Weapons create new wars. I'm too old for wars that don't end. He tapped the folder. If you ever want to see more, I'll show you. If you'd rather never think about it again, we can burn the paper and let the story stay wordless. I shook my head. Leave it here. It can exist without demanding attention, like some good deeds do. We stood like that for a while, the silence of the little library a balm rather than a threat. Outside, laughter rose and fell, the band starting an old standard that even my feet knew by heart. I pictured my parents somewhere sobered, perhaps suspicious, at how their storm had cleared itself. I pictured Samantha frowning at a ledger she didn't understand. And then I let the pictures go. Knowing was enough. Owning the knowledge was not required. When we stepped back onto the terrace, Aunt Mary met us with 2 flutes of champagne. She read my face the way only she could and squeezed my hand in a way that said she didn't need the details to trust their goodness. I turned, taking in the life in front of me. The children from my class chasing bubbles at the edge of the lawn, Damien's grandmother laughing with the curator, the glow of lanterns pooling around small circles of conversation. It was possible to feel ha-hey without bitterness, I realized. Possible to feel the scale finally tip toward rightness without shouting at the scale to watch itself move. Damien and I returned to the dance floor. He drew me close. All right, he murmured. More than all right, I said. Balanced. He nodded and spun me once the skirt of my dress lifting like a breath. Justice had arrived in the only form I could bear softly without claim or credit, restoring what mattered and letting the rest drift back to sea. Somewhere in a boardroom, my father would never see a signature had kept the lights on. Somewhere on a ledger that would never carry our names, a column that had been bleeding turned black again. And here under a roof of stars, I learned a truth. I wish I had known sooner. Victory doesn't always need noise. Sometimes it only needs to choose the right quiet. The celebration after our vows had lingered late into the night, but the next morning felt startlingly ordinary, in the best way, coffee on the terrace. Aunt Mary humming as she gathered stray ribbons, the children from my class sending me shaky phone videos of their favorite moments. The quiet was a balm. Then the noise returned, not at our doorstep, but out in the world where spectacle always finds fuel. By midweek, headlines had shifted from our wedding to a different story, a leaked clip, an old recording with a familiar voice. Samantha's. I didn't go looking for it. It found me the way such things do, forwarded by someone who assumed I already knew. I braced myself and pressed play. The audio was grainy, but the message was clear enough. Samantha's tone was cool and pointed as she spoke to Chris, my former fiancé. She reminded him of the small administrative mistake he'd made at school, something harmless that spun the wrong way, could sound like malfeasance. She hinted at friends on a parents' committee at how quickly concern could become complaint, how reputations could turn on a sentence, how careers could be ruined by whispers. End it with Ellie, she said, calm as a notary. It's better for everyone, especially you. I stopped the recording before the end and set the phone down. My first sensation wasn't rage. It was recognition. The timbre of her voice was the same one that had colored my childhood, the practiced confidence of someone who expects the world to rearrange itself. I had asked myself for months why Chris had folded so quickly, why he used words like unstable and too much. It turns out he had been frightened. Not just of my family's disdain, but of Samantha's leverage. The realization didn't absolve him, but it made a bleak kind of sense. By afternoon, the clip had spread. It wasn't just the audio. Text messages from the same period surfaced too, timestamps, threats phrased as favors, the steady drumbeat of pressure. Commentators who had courted Samantha for glossy spreads were suddenly measuring their distance. Then another headline broke: Charles, her fiancé of yacht party fame, had called off their engagement. His statement was brief and bloodless, mentioning irreconcilable differences and a commitment to integrity. I didn't gloat. I made tea. I watered the rosemary on the kitchen sill. I tried to keep my hands busy. That evening, a car pulled past the gate and stopped short. The intercom buzzed, and a guard called to say a woman was asking for me. Her name wasn't necessary. I could hear her even before I reached the front steps, the high, strangled sobs of someone unused to crying without an audience. Samantha stood there at the iron makeup-smudged expensive coat hanging wrong on her frame. For a second, she looked like the sister I'd once tried to catch up to, the girl who needed the world to be impressed so she could believe it loved her. Ellie, she said when she saw me, fingers wrapping around the bars as if they were the only solid thing left. I need your help. Please. The wind moved the vines. Somewhere behind me, Aunt Mary paused. I walked closer, but I didn't open the gate. What do you need? I asked, my voice even. She dragged in a breath. You saw it. The clip. It's complicated. People are making it into something it wasn't. Charles is gone. The PR firm won't take my calls. You could tell them. You could ask Damien to call someone. One statement from you that it was a misunderstanding, that I'm not. Her voice broke. I don't want my life to end like this. I studied her face, searching for the sister who might have once told the truth without bargaining. You threatened him, I said quietly. You threatened a man you knew I loved to get what you wanted. That wasn't complicated, it was cruel. She wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand, the gesture too hard, as if she'd forgotten gentleness. I did what I had to do. People do worse. You're in a different world now. Surely you understand how things work. I'm not asking for a miracle, just a little cover while this blows over. For years that plea would have split me in two. Family is supposed to be forever, even when it is terrible. But the woman she was asking, the one she remembered from our parents' table, was gone. I thought of the children in my class, the way they leaned over paper to draw their hard days into color. I thought of Damien, of the quiet file in a stone library that would never carry his name. I thought of the vows I had said without bitterness in my mouth. A life is a composition of choices. Hers had been consistent. I shook my head, not unkindly. You chose that road, Samantha. I don't owe you." Her face twisted as if the words were a slap. "You think you're better than us now?" She spat, the old blade flashing. "You married money and forgot where you came from." "No," I answered soft, because there was no need to be loud. I remembered where I came from and chose not to live there anymore. For a moment only the gate spoke a faint shiver of iron in the evening chill. She pressed her lips together, fury giving way to something like vacancy. I could see the reflex in her, the calculation, the search for a lever that would move me. When she found none, she stumbled back from the bars and stared past me at the house as if it might refuse to exist unless she named it. "I have a class starting," I said. And it was true. The kids were coming for an evening session in the studio over the garage. We were painting a mural that threaded all our small canvases into one river of color. "Take care of yourself, Samantha." I turned and walked back up the path. There was no triumph in the movement, but there was firmness. Aunt Mary met me at the door, her eyes asking if I needed to talk. I shook my head and kissed her cheek. In the studio, the first two students had already arrived, shrugs and laughter trailing in like friendly ghosts. I hung my apron on its hook and washed my hands, the familiar ritual returning me to the person I had spent months rebuilding. We set out jars of tempera and paper plates for pallets. I knelt beside a boy who always began in black and coaxed a little green into his storm. A girl who liked to draw fireworks asked me how to make gold, and I showed her how a dab of yellow warmed with brown could glow without glitter. Through the open window, I heard a car start at the gate and drive away. The mural took shape block by block, a house, a bridge, a bird over water. On my tile, I painted a small door opening into light. The truth was simple: compassion didn't require amnesia, and forgiveness didn't require fellowship. I could wish my sister well from the far side of a boundary I should have built years ago. I could choose a life she could not enter until she learned the language of accountability. By the time class ended, the children had left their fingerprints all over the world we were making. I stood in the quiet and looked at the river running across the wall. It curved where it wanted, colored by many hands, unconcerned with who stood watching on the shore. I cleaned the brushes, turned off the lights, and carried the quiet with me down the stairs. Outside, the evening had settled. No headlines, no intercom buzzing. Only the vineyard beyond the fence and the knowledge that I had not gone back to the old house inside me. 2 days after Samantha stood crying at my gate, the morning news carried a teaser that made Aunt Mary set down her coffee. A popular daytime talk show had booked an exclusive sit-down with the Monroe family. The promo showed my parents and Samantha arranged on a velvet couch, tissues in hand, the host leaning forward with sympathetic eyes. I felt a tug in my stomach that was not quite dread and not quite curiosity, more the old muscle memory of bracing for a story I already knew the shape of. By afternoon, the studio audience was clapping on cue, and the lights bathed my family in the sort of glow that flatters even the harshest angles. I stood at the kitchen counter with Damien, the television sound low. A chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "A family seeks healing." The host began gently, as they always do, inviting my mother to speak. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling just enough to register on camera. She talked about how difficult it is to raise 2 daughters with very different temperaments. She said the word artistic as if it were a diagnosis. She described my storms in broad strokes, then framed their distance as tough love. My father chimed in to say they had done their best with a sensitive child. Samantha stared down at her hands, then looked up and said she wished she had supported me more, but that my teenage years had been volatile and the family had been walking on eggshells. I didn't stay for the next sentence. I clicked the remote and the screen went black. The sudden quiet felt like fresh air after a room had grown stale. Damien glanced at me, waiting. I rested the remote on the counter and said evenly, "They're not apologizing to me. They're excusing themselves." He nodded once, not pushing me to explain what didn't need explaining. Aunt Mary, who had been rinsing brushes at the sink, turned off the water and leaned a hip against the counter. "You don't need their storytelling anymore," she said. "You've written your own." I poured tea and let the cup warm my hands. In another time, I might have watched the whole performance hoping to hear a word that sounded like accountability. But I had learned the difference between remorse and reputation management. When an apology begins by naming your supposed defects and ends by praising their intentions, it isn't an apology. It's a press release. While the show aired, the internet did what it does. It watched clipped and commented. Within an hour, the most replayed moment was not a tearful confession, but the pause after the host asked how they had supported my art. My mother spoke about buying me sketch pads when she was good. My father mentioned encouraging stable careers. Samantha said she had always been inspired by my creativity. Someone stitched that claim next to the leaked audio of her threatening Chris, and the contrast did the heavy lifting for anyone still on the fence. By evening, my phone lit with messages from people I'd known since childhood, and others I had never met. A former neighbor wrote to say she remembered me painting on the back steps, while the rest of the block set out lawn chairs for Samantha's pageant rehearsals. She apologized for not seeing me more clearly then. A parent from my art class posted a long note about how I had shown her son a way to express what he couldn't explain, adding that anyone who called that volatile didn't understand what grace looks like in practice. The curator who had hosted my first real show wrote a short, sharp thread about the difference between difficult and dismissed. The tide was turning without me lifting a finger. Damien set his phone face down and looked at me across the table. "It's odd," he said, watching a whole machine spool up and then trip over its own cables. His tone wasn't triumphant. It was observational, almost tender, as if he were remarking on weather finally breaking after a long front. I took a sip of tea. For years I kept thinking if I could get them to understand me, I'd be safe. I let the thought settle, then added, "Turns out I was safe the moment I stopped asking them to understand." We didn't turn the television back on. We went for a walk along the edge of the vineyard, instead, the late light turning the hills the color of honey. When we returned, I checked my messages not for commentary, but for the practical sort of notes that had become the rhythm of my days. Supply orders for the art class, a thank you from a gallery intern, a photograph from one of the kids holding up a canvas that exploded with orange and blue. In my inbox sat a link to a segment from the same talk show posted an hour after the broadcast. The producers had put up a poll, "Do you believe the Monroe family's apology was sincere?" The comments beneath it were unsparing and, more importantly, specific. Strangers had learned my history in pieces, my parents skipping my ceremony. The yacht, the dress meant to cover embarrassment, but they were not unkind on my behalf. They were precise. They heard the hedges, the disclaimers, the careful rerouting of guilt. What rose out of that discernment was not a pile-on but a correction. People shared stories of their own families, how public kindness can be a mask for private meanness, how being labeled too much is often what happens to girls who refuse to disappear. It was not a chorus written for me. It was a language I recognized and had longed to hear spoken aloud. Later, while I tidied the studio, Aunt Mary came in with a plate of lemon bars. "The whole town could line up with bouquets and a band and it still wouldn't matter," she said. "Not because you're unforgiving, because you don't need a parade to keep walking." I laughed softly. "I did love a parade once." "Then you'll have your own," she said. "Small, honest, the kind that ends at a table where you want to sit." That night, Damien and I sat on the steps outside the sky pricked with early stars. He read to me from a book of essays he kept by the bed, his voice low and even, the sentences clicking into place like beads on a string. My phone buzzed a few more times, and then quieted. Somewhere my family's PR team was likely drafting follow-ups, booking the next sympathetic platform, rewriting the script. But that cycle belonged to them, not to me. Before we went in, I wondered aloud what I might have felt if they had looked into the camera and said, "We were wrong." Not, "We had a difficult child." Not, "We did our best." Just, "We were wrong. We hurt her. We are sorry." Damien took my hand. "You don't need an answer," he said. "You only need to know what you will and will not accept." I thought about that as we turned out the lights. I had not set the record straight or issued a statement or posted a rebuttal. I had watched 10 seconds and chosen my piece. And the world astonishingly had met me there. Not because I demanded loyalty, but because the truth once finally aired did what truth does. It stood on its own feet. In the morning, I would hang fresh paper on the studio wall and hand out clean brushes. The kids would arrive with their unruly joy and their honest questions. We would keep building the river we had started, letting it find its course. And somewhere off camera, my family would reckon with a thing they could not script, a life that kept moving forward without them. 2 mornings after the talk show spectacle, the vineyard was quiet again, the kind of quiet that lets a person hear her own decisions. I stood at the studio sink rinsing brushes when the thought arrived not as a summons, but as a settling I needed to close the door of the old house myself. Not with a statement or a post, but with footsteps on a familiar porch, and words I had waited years to say. I called Aunt Mary first. She didn't ask why. She only asked what time I wanted to meet. The drive back into my childhood neighborhood felt smaller than I remembered. The trees along our street had grown thicker, but the houses seemed to have shrunk like sets after the lights go down. My parents' home was exactly as it had always been: brick, a shade 2 proud hedges trimmed to attention, the brass knocker polished for company that seldom came without conditions. Aunt Mary was already there, seated on the front steps with a paper cup of coffee, her paint-splattered tote at her feet. When she saw me, she stood and opened her arms, and I walked straight into them, the way children do when they have been brave for a long time and can finally stop. We held on longer than a passerby might consider necessary, longer than I could have allowed in another life. There are some embraces that say more than conversation: I am here. I always was. You are safe. When we stepped back, Mary brushed a stray hair from my cheek, her eyes bright. You look like yourself, she said, and in her mouth that sentence wasn't casual, it was a benediction. I came to ask you something. I told her, my hands finding hers still strong, still stained with a lifetime of color. Come live with us, in the city. You can keep your cottage if you want, visited as often as you like, but I want you where you are, not just a rescue line I call. I want you home with me. She laughed softly, and then pressed her lips together to stop their trembling. My garden will scold me, she said, because humor is how our family's best members keep tears from upsetting the table. And my little studio, it knows all my secrets. We'll build you another, I said. A sunlit room with north-facing windows, and a door no one feels entitled to open. We'll plant rosemary and the wild mint you always lose control of. You won't be uprooted, just repotted. I squeezed her fingers. I am here because you were. Let me carry you for a while. She bowed her head, not out of modesty, but in the posture of someone receiving good news. All right, she said at last. If you promise I can still keep a cup by every sink and leave brushes in the wrong jars. I'll buy you more jars, I said, and we both laughed, because it was either that or cry again. The front door opened, and my mother appeared, surprise registering as a performance she didn't have time to rehearse. She took in the sight of me and Mary hand in hand on her porch, and for a heartbeat she looked like a person who had arrived late to her own play. My father hovered behind her, shoulder expression set to neutral, the face he wore at bank meetings when he thought he ought to appear reasonable. I see you've come, my mother said, as if I might need confirmation of the obvious. We were just about to call you. There are some things to discuss after everything. She gestured vaguely as if the talk show and the wedding and the headlines were confetti she could sweep into a tidy corner. I didn't come to discuss anything, I said, not unkindly. There was no edge in my voice, only the flat calm of weather that has decided not to storm. I came to see Mary and to say what should have been said years ago. My father folded his arms, already weary of being the man who didn't get to set the agenda. If you're here to scold, I'm not, I said. Because scolding is a bid for change, and I had retired from that job. I wanted to see the place one last time with clear eyes. That's all. He shifted, ready to argue about whether I was being fair about who had been difficult and who had done their best. I raised a hand gently, and to my surprise, he went still. "I don't hate you," I said. And it was true. Hatred takes energy I no longer spend on old walls. But I don't have a reason to stay. Not in this house. Not in this dynamic. My mother's mouth wavered toward a hurt she wanted me to patch. After everything we've said on television, I looked at Mary, not at my mother. "I heard what you said." I answered. I heard who it served. There was no triumph in me, no urge to twist the knife. The house smelled the way it always had, lemon oil and a ghost of pot roast, and somewhere upstairs a clock ticked like a metronome, reminding everyone to keep pace. I realized I didn't have to convince a single piece of furniture to let me go. The room would not chase me, the carpet would not grab my ankles, the past would not chain itself to my ribs. Leaving could be as simple as turning and putting one foot in front of the other. Mary sensed the small shift and slid her tote over her shoulder. "I'll come by this weekend," she told my parents gently, "because she cannot help being kind. I'll pack my things and see what needs donating. The azaleas will survive without me. They always do." My mother blinked. "You're moving out." She looked between us, suddenly unsure which loss she should attend to. "With her, with me," I said, though I didn't add a case for why that should matter to them. "We'll send a forwarding address for anything that finds my name." I stepped forward and kissed my mother's cheek because it was the last nice thing I could give without debt attached. I shook my father's hand because that was the language he understood. The gestures were not olive branches. They were signatures on a document that had been waiting years for ink. On the walk back to the car, I felt the strange lightness of a traveler who finally returned her borrowed map. Mary tucked her arm through mine. "You did well," she said. "You didn't set fire to the curtains." "I wanted to," I admitted, smiling because some fantasies are better left in the imagination. But I remembered I don't live there anymore. Ash is a terrible scent to bring into a clean house. We drove by her cottage so she could pick up a few things, and I watched her move through the rooms with the competence of someone who knows what is essential and what can stay. She took the mug with the hairline crack that only she could sip from without spilling. She took the tin of charcoal sticks wrapped in an old scarf. She left the cracked stool by the door where neighborhood kids had learned to tie their shoes because she said the next child might need it. Little mercies, even in a leaving. Back in the city by late afternoon, I walked Mary through the small apartment that would be home until we finished building the studio at the larger house. She tested the light by the windows, knocked on the kitchen counter like it might reveal its secrets, and opened every cupboard like a general reviewing troops. When she turned to me, there was mischief in her smile. "I'll need better lamps," she said, "and a shelf I can reach without a stool, and a hook by the door for an apron that refuses to be put away. All of that I promised, and a garden stubborn enough to survive us both." As evening folded the city into a softer shape, we stood on the small balcony and watched the street lamps blink on. Somewhere my parents were likely editing their next speech. Somewhere a producer was deciding which clip would pull the highest ratings. None of that lived here. Here there was a kettle coming to a low, companionable boil, and a table set for two women who had found a way to mean home to each other. I poured tea and placed the cracked mug in Mary's hands. She raised it in a quiet toast. "To doors closed without slamming," she said. "And to rooms we choose," I answered. We sipped in unhurried peace. The old house stood where it always had, and I wished it no harm. I simply granted it what I finally granted myself permission to belong to the past. Tomorrow we would measure a wall for shelves and argue about lamp heights and plant mint in a too-small pot and laugh when it escaped. Tomorrow we would live forward. Tonight I held the afterglow of a long journey's necessary stop, the warmth of an embrace that started it all, and the relief of leaving a place without taking its shadows home. The first morning in our new rhythm felt ordinary in the best way. Aunt Mary claimed the small corner of the kitchen as hers, sliding a cup onto the counter, where she said a cup needed to live, and I brewed coffee while the windows gathered a square of winter sun. The city sounded different from the vineyard, hushed but present, like a neighbor clearing his throat down the hall. We had measured a wall for shelves, argued companionably about lamp heights, and set a box of brushes by the studio door. There was nothing dramatic left to do, only the work of inhabiting a life we had chosen. It was in that quiet that an old thought rose and asked to be finished. I carried a notebook into the studio, the kind with heavy paper that doesn't bleed when you hesitate. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall where the children's mural would eventually go, and let myself remember the version of me who had lived 2 years earlier. She had walked around the edges of rooms checking faces for weather editing herself to fit the forecast. She had apologized for taking up space. I thought of her, and for the first time felt a tenderness that had nothing to do with pity. She had kept going. That fact alone deserved an answer. I dated the page for a day 2 years in the past, and I wrote, "Dear Ellie, I know you're tired of hearing what you should be, so I won't tell you that. I will tell you what I know now that you don't have yet. You don't need to become anyone to be loved. You just need to be yourself. There will be people who mistake your quiet for weakness and your feeling for fault. They will call caution dramatic and tenderness naive. They will stand on furniture and announce their stories as truth, and you will be tempted to borrow their language to explain your own heart. Don't. The words you need live in your hands. When they fail your mouth, they arrive as color. Trust that. You will be left out and told it is for your own good. You will be invited and told it is a privilege you haven't earned. Both are ways of saying someone else wants to author your worth. Step back. Pick up the brush. Begin again at the corner that is yours to paint. You will love and be disappointed. You will think that means you chose badly. Sometimes it will mean that. Sometimes it will mean the person in front of you is choosing fear over courage. Don't call that your fault. You were brave enough to offer your whole name. Keep it. People will apologize for the parts of you that make them uncomfortable. They may do it on television with a soft light and good hair. You don't owe anyone a performance of forgiveness. When you forgive, do it for the space it opens inside your chest, not for applause. Forgiveness is not a bridge back. It is a door into air. You will meet a man who looks at your work before he looks at your face. He will stand beside you without asking you to shorten yourself by a single inch. When he asks you to step forward, it will not be to stand in front of him, but with him. You will hesitate. He will wait. That will tell you what you need to know. You'll build a room where children learn their own languages, and nothing will feel more holy than watching a 7-year-old lay down a streak of yellow and gasp because joy surprised her. Those children will not care who approved you. They will care that you keep paper in stock and that you notice when they add a window to a house. Notice. It's how you become the adult you needed. You will go home to say goodbye to the idea of home, and you will mean it. Leaving is not a violence. It is a skill. Practice it kindly and without a speech. When doubt comes, and it will stand where there is light and say your name out loud. Yours is a good name. Keep it clean of the dust other people kick up when they rush through their own messes. Wash your hands. Return to the page. You don't need to become anyone to be loved. You just need to be yourself. Love, Ellie. When the words slowed, I set the notebook down and listened to the room. Traffic hummed like a far river. Somewhere Aunt Mary clinked a spoon against a mug. I read the letter through once, not to edit, but to be sure it sounded like the person I wanted to keep being. It did. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a kindness I wished someone had handed me when I needed a compass. I copied the letter onto good paper, letting the ink dry before I slid it into a simple frame. I hung it in the studio by the window at a height that invited reading, not reverence. It looked almost plain there, a white rectangle surrounded by color, but it held the room the way a true north steadies a map. When Aunt Mary walked in with a tray of thumbtacks and clothespins, she stopped in front of the frame and stood very still. "That's a proper instruction," she said, "for big people and small ones." The next day, the children arrived like weather blustery bright, a little off balance from school. Coats landed on hooks like birds, and chatter filled the space between tables and jars of paint. I let them begin their projects before I pointed to the new frame and told them it was something I had written to a girl I used to be. They didn't ask which girl. Children accept that adulthood contains multitudes. Halfway through class, I noticed Rosa, a serious 8-year-old with careful braids and a collection of erasers shaped like fruit, standing in front of the letter. She read it with her lips moving slightly, proof that she was reading for meaning, not speed. When she finished, she looked back at her painting, then at me, and raised a hand as if this were a question with only one correct answer. "Miss Ellie," she said, "you're the strongest person I know." At 28, I would have deflected with a joke or a blush. I might have said strength was complicated, or that grown-ups pretend well. I might have pushed the praise away because it frightened me to be seen. Now I smiled and walked over and crouched so we were eye level. "Thank you," I said. "Sometimes strong looks like knowing when to sit down. Sometimes it looks like starting over. Today, for me, it looks like hanging a letter on a wall." I tapped the frame lightly. "What does strong look like for you?" She thought for longer than children usually allow themselves to think in groups. "It looks like drawing a cat." "Even if my cousin says cats are baby art," she said, and not letting him color in my sky without asking. "Excellent answers," I said, and meant it. "Make your cat." She did, with a tail so confident it could have balanced on a fence, and when her cousin came to look, she covered the paper with her arm and said, "Ask first," in a tone that held the whole point of the letter. When the room finally emptied and the light tipped toward evening, I stayed a moment longer, straightening paper stacks and rinsing brushes so they would last through another class. I paused in front of the framed page and read the line again. "You don't need to become anyone to be loved. You just need to be yourself." It did not solve anything complicated. It did not erase regret. It did something better. It quieted the old hunger to audition for belonging. Across town, people could still be telling stories about me. Here, children were learning how to say yes and no to a blank page. Here, I had given my past self a ladder and my present self a place to lean it. I switched off the lights, and the glass over the letter caught the last of the sun before the room surrendered to lamplight. In the hallway, Aunt Mary had hung a hook for an apron that refuses to be put away. I placed mine there and listened to the soft click as it settled. Then I carried the quiet into the kitchen where the kettle waited, and the evening promised nothing grand, only the long, steady work of living in a life that fits. The city settled into evening the way a quilt settles over a sleeping child, one light at a time, one window at a time, until the streets below looked like a constellation humming softly to itself. The rooftop terrace had become our favorite room of the house, even though it had no walls. Planter boxes framed the edges with herbs and night-blooming jasmine, and a bench Damien insisted on sanding himself ran along the low brick. Aunt Mary had strung a line of small bulbs overhead that made everything feel held. After dinner, we carried mugs upstairs and let the air be our conversation for a while. Below us, the steady tide of the city rose and fell. Across from our building, a woman watered plants under a tiny string of lights, and down the block a teenage boy practiced trumpet stops and starts, working toward a song he could nearly catch. I told Damien it was the perfect soundtrack for a life that wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He laughed and said he would ask the boy for a set list. "What did Mary think of the letter?" he asked after a while, his shoulder warm against mine. "She called it an instruction," I said, "for big people and small ones." I told him about Rosa and her cat, and how she guarded her paper with a forearm and a clear boundary. He nodded as if I'd reported on a small necessary victory in a long campaign. We sat like that, naming good things without ornament. Tomorrow, I would teach 2 classes and meet with the contractor about Mary's studio windows. Next month, there would be another exhibit, not large, but enough to set the work in conversation with other hands. Damien had a board meeting in the morning, the unglamorous kind that keeps good things from wobbling. We were planning to take Mary to the coast over the weekend for clam chowder in paper cups and a walk along a wine-thinned beach. None of it needed applause to be real. On the low table between us, beneath the tray with our mugs and a little dish of sliced pears, lay an envelope. It had arrived at noon, hand-delivered by a courier with the posture of someone used to signatures. My name was written in my mother's careful script, the same loops that had labeled my lunchboxes in elementary school. Damien had brought it up to the terrace without comment, and there it had lived for hours. A quiet object asking a question I no longer felt obliged to answer. He glanced at it now, then at me. "Do you want to talk about that?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not especially." I lifted my mug and let the steam warm my nose. It can sit there and learn patience. He smiled, but he didn't press. The man I had married knew the difference between the past requesting a hearing and the past deserving one. If I never opened it, the sky would not fall. If I did, it would be because my center had asked, not because a familiar voice had knocked. We watched the last stripe of pink leave the horizon. A breeze moved across the rooftop and lifted the jasmine perfume. Somewhere in the building, someone laughed in a kitchen. Across the street, the woman flicked off her string lights, and the trumpet boy finally held a run of notes long enough that his tune broke open and became itself. Damien closed his eyes, listening as if he could hold the sound longer by honoring it. "Do you ever worry?" he asked softly, "that peace will feel like defeat?" "Not anymore," I said. "It used to. When I confused quiet with erasure. When I thought I had to win to be real." I traced a finger around a water ring on the table and watched the circle evaporate. Now it feels like the right-sized life, not smaller. True. We talked then about small plans and big ones. He asked if I wanted to add a morning class for seniors who kept calling the center asking for a spot. I told him I did. He said the gallery's education director wanted to pay for field trips so the kids could stand in front of paintings that weren't theirs yet and say I could do that. I said yes to that too. We debated shelves versus drawers for Mary's charcoal and came to the only logical conclusion: both. The envelope stayed where it was, a white square of yesterday on the table. I could hear my mother's voice inside it if I tried explanations shaped like apologies, apologies shaped like invitations. A hand extended that never quite acknowledged what it had taken. A year ago, that possibility would have tugged at me like undertow. Tonight, it was just paper. The life around it had mass. The jasmine had a name. The boy's trumpet had a melody. The woman across the street had a routine. My day had a spine. Damien reached for my hand without looking the way people do when they know where the other hand lives. We sat that way until the mugs cooled, until the air found its edge, until the sky settled into the deep blue. That means it has made its decision about the day. Finally, I slid the envelope a few inches so it no longer sat dead center, and I felt the faintest shift inside me, the click of a bead on a thread that had been waiting for a place to rest. "What will you do with it?" he asked. "Nothing for now," I said. "Maybe nothing forever." He nodded. "I'll be here for either." We talked about nothing for a while, about the plant that refused to thrive in the northeast corner of the terrace no matter how we cajoled it. About the way Mary had charmed the electrician into promising the pretty fixtures instead of the merely adequate. About the bakery on 9th that insisted on giving us an extra roll because the owner liked the mural the children had painted in the window. We let the night make the room bigger. At some point I realized I was no longer measuring my responses against the imagined gaze of people not present. I wasn't writing sentences in my head to justify my choices. If my mother had placed different words in that envelope, if I might still have chosen to leave it closed. The boundary wasn't a punishment. It was a shape that fit my life. A letter could live inside a drawer. A life could live on a rooftop with a view of a city and the sound of a trumpet. We gathered our things at last. I picked up the envelope, weighed it in my hand, felt the breath of old rooms and set it back down. Then I pushed back my chair and stood stretching my arms until my shoulders loosened. "Ready?" Damien asked. "Ready," I said. We carried empty mugs toward the stairwell, and I flicked off the string of bulbs one by one. The terrace dimmed to moon and city light, and the envelope disappeared into the dark like a stone at the bottom of a pond, still there, no longer commanding the surface. At the top of the stairs, I paused and looked back, not to reconsider but to mark a frame. The bench, the planters, the table, the space where we had sat and let the day end. Nothing dramatic, everything sufficient. On the landing, Damien brushed a kiss against my temple and held the door open. I stepped inside. The air was warm with the last of the jasmine and a house that had learned our names. I reached to turn off the hall light, and in the easy quiet between click and shadow, I knew the sentence that had been waiting to end this chapter, not by shutting something, but by setting it down. Forgiveness doesn't need an audience. And that brings us to the close of Ellie's journey, a story that began in a backyard dismissed as trash and ended under the city lights where she chose love, freedom, and her own worth. If you stayed with me through every turn, I hope you felt the quiet triumph of her choices and the strength in her silence. Stories like this are not just entertainment. They are reminders that dignity and resilience belong to all of us, no matter how late in life they arrive. I would love to know what this story stirred in you. Have you ever faced a moment when you chose yourself, even if others said you were not enough? Share that memory in the comments, because when we trade these pieces of truth, we build courage together. And if you want more stories of family of betrayal and redemption of women who rise stronger than anyone expected, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Your voice and your presence here matter. Thank you for spending these hours with me, and until the next story, hold on to the reminder. Ellie left us, forgiveness does not need an audience.